The vaults beneath Buckingham Palace were never silent. Guards changed shifts, steel doors opened and sealed again with the sound of machinery built to survive war. Curators moved through narrow corridors, carrying velvet trays under white gloves. Yet even among the thousands of diamonds, sapphires, emeralds and pearls owned by the British Crown, there were jewels almost no one ever saw, not diplomats, not royal brides, not even senior members of the family. Some appeared once beneath the chandeliers of state banquets, blazing for a single evening before vanishing for decades. Others disappeared entirely from public life, locked away so completely that historians began to question whether they still existed at all. And this is where the story becomes unsettling. Because Queen Elizabeth II did not merely inherit jewels, she inherited ghosts attached to them. Every tiara carried political memory. Every necklace carried scandal, betrayal, revolution, death, exile, greed, and empire. Certain stones were so entangled with damaged dynasties and private humiliation that the Queen herself quietly removed them from circulation. No announcement was made, no explanation was offered. The jewels simply stopped appearing. That silence became part of the mystery. For decades, royal watchers focused on the famous pieces, the Imperial state crown, the Cullinan diamonds, the Vladimir tiara. But hidden behind those celebrated treasures was another collection altogether, jewels too controversial, too emotional, or too dangerous to wear publicly. Some belonged to fallen queens. Some came from aristocratic families destroyed by war. Others were linked to colonial violence that modern Britain preferred not to discuss in public. Elizabeth II understood something many people overlooked. Jewels are never only decoration. They are political language cut into stone. And frankly, that is what makes this story impossible to ignore. Because when the most photographed woman in the 20th century refuses to wear certain jewels, historians start asking why. The official royal inventories reveal fragments. Old court photographs reveal more. Auction records, diplomatic correspondence, handwritten wardrobe notes, and testimonies from former palace staff slowly exposed the outline of a hidden collection, pieces rarely discussed even inside palace walls. There were necklaces dismantled in secret, tiaras altered beyond recognition, brooches associated with mistresses, disgraced relatives, and imperial conquest. One former royal dresser reportedly described sections of the collection as emotionally radioactive. That phrase lingered with me. Emotionally radioactive, not cursed in the fairy tale sense. Worse, historically poisoned. Elizabeth II understood optics better than almost any modern monarch. Her survival depended on restraint. During 70 years on the throne, she mastered the art of symbolic silence. She knew when a jewel could send the wrong message to a struggling nation. She knew when diamonds looked excessive during economic crisis. She knew when inherited treasures carried too much blood in their history. And in private, according to several royal biographers, she could be surprisingly decisive. Certain pieces were not to leave the vault. Ever. One of the earliest examples emerged shortly after her accession in 1952. Britain was still exhausted from war. Rationing had only recently ended. Cities still carried bomb scars. The empire itself was beginning to fracture. Yet within palace vaults rested jewels collected during the height of imperial dominance, enormous gemstones presented by maharajas, colonial governors, oil rulers, and aristocrats desperate to remain close to the crown. To wear some of them publicly in the new political climate would have appeared tone-deaf at best, grotesque at worst. Elizabeth knew it immediately. Unlike some of her royal predecessors, she rarely treated jewels as personal indulgence. She treated them as instruments of monarchy. That distinction mattered enormously, and nowhere was it clearer than in her handling of the Oriental circlet, one of the strangest tiaras in royal history. Commissioned originally for Queen Victoria in the 19th century, the piece combined enormous diamonds with opals, stones many royal families considered unlucky. Victoria adored opals despite the superstition. Later generations did not. By the time Elizabeth inherited the collection, the tiara had practically vanished from royal use. Officially, there was no ban. Unofficially, the palace seemed deeply uncomfortable with it. And honestly, I understand why. The tiara carried the heavy aesthetic of Imperial Britain at its absolute peak, lavish, aggressive, unapologetically dominant. In the age of decolonisation, that symbolism had become dangerous. Elizabeth wore it only rarely. Then it disappeared almost entirely from public life. Even seasoned royal historians struggled to trace its movements through the archives. That pattern would repeat itself again and again throughout her reign. Jewels fading into darkness, not because they lacked beauty, but because they carried too much meaning. The deeper historians looked into the royal vault, the stranger the absences became. Certain jewels appeared in official inventories, but almost never in photographs. Others surfaced once during a state banquet, then vanished so completely that younger curators reportedly knew them only from black and white archive cards. In royal collections, disappearance is rarely accidental. Every tiara withdrawn from circulation creates questions inside palace corridors, and over time, one pattern became impossible to ignore. The jewels Elizabeth II avoided most often were usually connected to women whose lives had collapsed under the pressure of monarchy itself. That detail changes the entire story. Because behind the diamonds stood queens, empresses, duchesses, and princesses who had paid terrifying personal prices for proximity to the crown. One of the clearest examples was the Delhi Durbar tiara, an immense platinum structure commissioned for Queen Mary in 1911 before the Imperial celebrations in India. Even by royal standards, the piece was overwhelming. Rows of diamonds rose upward like frozen blades of light. It was designed not merely to impress, but to dominate. When Queen Mary wore it during the Delhi Durbar ceremony, Britain was displaying imperial authority at full force before Indian rulers and colonial subjects alike. The message was unmistakable. The empire considered itself eternal. History had other plans. By the time Elizabeth II inherited the tiara decades later, India was independent, the empire was dissolving, and public attitudes toward colonialism were beginning to shift. The symbolism attached to the piece had become explosive, and yet the tiara itself remained magnificent. Too magnificent, perhaps, to destroy or dismantle. So the Queen did something colder and more strategic. She almost erased it through silence. The Delhi Durbar tiara was scarcely worn during her reign. When Camilla eventually appeared in it many years later, royal observers were stunned, partly because the jewel had become nearly mythical through absence alone. But during Elizabeth's era, it stayed buried inside the vault for long stretches, as though the monarchy hoped people might forget what it represented. And this is the uncomfortable truth hidden beneath royal glamour. Jewels remember political systems long after nations try to move on from them. I keep returning to that image, diamonds sleeping in darkness because history became too embarrassing to display openly. Another vanished treasure carried an even heavier emotional charge. The Romanov sapphire brooch, inherited through the tangled bloodlines of Europe's royal families, had connections reaching back toward the Russian imperial court before the revolution. The Romanovs had not merely fallen, they had been annihilated, executed in abasement, their jewels scattered across Europe through smugglers, surviving relatives, and secret sales. Every surviving Romanov jewel carried the aura of catastrophe. Elizabeth occasionally wore sapphire pieces linked to those networks of inheritance, but certain items surfaced only briefly before disappearing again. Palace officials never discussed why. They never needed to. Royal collections operate through coded understanding. Some jewels evoke triumph, others evoke execution cellars and collapsing dynasties. And Elizabeth, despite her controlled public image, was deeply conscious of continuity. That mattered enormously to her. She had watched monarchies disappear across Europe during the 20th century, Greece, Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Russia long before them. She understood that royal families survive only when they appear stable, disciplined, and emotionally contained. Extravagance could become dangerous overnight. That fear shaped how she wore jewels. People often imagine royal collections as fantasy objects detached from ordinary reality. In truth, they function more like political weapons wrapped in velvet. During periods of economic hardship, Elizabeth reduced displays of excessive gemstones. During diplomatic tensions, she selected jewels associated with specific nations to send subtle signals of alliance. During scandals inside the royal family, she often retreated into simpler pieces altogether, almost as if minimizing visual noise around the institution. But the forbidden jewels were different. Those were not merely set aside for convenience, they were isolated. Former royal staff members occasionally hinted at this hidden hierarchy inside the vault. Certain drawers were opened constantly for state occasions. Others remained untouched year after year. One retired courtier later described entering a restricted jewellery room where pieces were stored with handwritten notes detailing fragile historical sensitivities attached to them. No official confirmation of those notes has ever emerged publicly. Still, the pattern fits Elizabeth's reign perfectly. She governed through caution, through calibration, through restraint. And nowhere was that restraint more visible than in the fate of jewels connected to Wallis Simpson. Even decades after the abdication crisis of 1936, the scars inside the royal family remained astonishingly raw. Edward VIII had abandoned the throne for Wallis, triggering constitutional chaos and emotional devastation that permanently altered the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II grew up in the shadow of that trauma. Her father became king only because his brother walked away. The pressure eventually consumed him physically and emotionally. The family never truly forgave Wallis. Her jewels, however, were another matter entirely. They were extraordinary. Cartier created some of the most dazzling pieces of the 20th century for the Duchess of Windsor. Flamingos covered in rubies and sapphires, bracelets alive with movement, diamonds set with theatrical boldness completely unlike the restrained style preferred by the House of Windsor. These were not ceremonial jewels. They were declarations of seduction, appetite, and private luxury. And Elizabeth wanted distance from all of it. Not because the pieces lacked beauty, quite the opposite. They were too memorable, too connected to scandal, too tied to the woman blamed fairly or unfairly for nearly breaking the monarchy itself. In public, the Queen maintained perfect composure regarding the Windsors. In private, according to multiple biographers, the emotional damage ran far deeper than palace officials ever admitted openly. The hostility surrounding Wallis Simpson never entirely disappeared inside royal circles. Time softened public fascination, but within the palace the abdication remained something closer to inherited trauma. Courtiers who served George VI carried bitterness into old age. Older members of staff lowered their voices when speaking about the Duchess of Windsor, even decades later, and the jewels associated with her became objects of almost superstitious discomfort. That tension mattered because royal jewels often circulate through generations. Tiaras are loaned, brooches reappear on younger royals, necklaces are dismantled and remade to fit changing fashion. But Wallis's pieces largely remained outside that cycle. They existed almost like sealed evidence from a crime scene the family wanted forgotten. One former royal jewellery expert described the situation bluntly. Some jewels carried too much emotional residue. That phrase stayed with me because it reveals something deeply human beneath the machinery of monarchy. Elizabeth II was not simply preserving objects, she was managing memory itself, and memory inside royal families can become lethal. The Queen learned that lesson early. When she was still a young princess during World War II, Buckingham Palace itself was bombed multiple times during the Blitz, windows shattered, staff members died elsewhere across London nightly. Europe's royal houses were collapsing or fleeing into exile. In that atmosphere, luxury became politically dangerous. Public displays of excess could trigger fury among ordinary citizens struggling to survive. George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, deliberately cultivated an image of endurance and restraint. Their daughter absorbed every detail. By the time Elizabeth reached the throne, she understood instinctively that survival depended on controlling symbols. Jewels were among the most dangerous symbols of all. And perhaps no collection embodied that danger more vividly than the Greville bequest. When the fabulously wealthy socialite Dame Margaret Greville died in 1942, she left an astonishing cache of jewels to the royal family. The collection included enormous diamond tiaras, emerald necklaces, and some of the finest Cartier creations in Europe. Yet the inheritance carried whispers that never fully disappeared. Greville herself had accumulated extraordinary wealth through elite social connections during the late Imperial era, and rumours about the origins of certain stones followed the collection for decades. Some historians believe Elizabeth quietly reduced public appearances of several Greville pieces because they projected exactly the kind of aristocratic extravagance modern Britain increasingly distrusted after the war. Again, there was no public decree. The palace never announces these things. Silence is its preferred language, but the absence became visible over time. One tiara in particular seemed to unsettle even experienced royal observers, the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik tiara. It was massive, sharp-edged, imperial in scale. Emeralds hung from it like fragments of frozen green fire. When worn under palace lighting, the piece looked almost unreal, closer to the treasures of a fallen empire than modern constitutional monarchy. Elizabeth rarely touched it, and frankly, I think she understood exactly what audiences would see in it. Not continuity, not service, power without restraint, wealth detached from ordinary life. The very image the monarchy spent decades trying to soften after 2 world wars and the collapse of empire. What fascinates me most is how deliberate her decisions often were. Elizabeth II never appeared careless with jewels. Every public appearance was studied intensely by palace advisors. Sapphire or pearl, daytime or evening, Commonwealth event or military ceremony. Even brooches could carry diplomatic significance. During tense meetings with American presidents, Canadian leaders, or European heads of state, royal watchers routinely decoded her jewellery choices like political messages hidden in plain sight. So when a jewel disappeared completely, that absence carried meaning too. One of the most haunting examples involved the Cambridge emeralds, gemstones linked to Queen Mary and earlier generations of European royalty. Several pieces connected to the emerald set appeared only sporadically throughout Elizabeth's reign, despite their extraordinary quality. The likely reason lay partly in aesthetics, but also in history. Emeralds carried associations with old dynastic Europe, with imperial courts that no longer existed, Romanovs, Habsburgs, German princely houses swept away by war and revolution. Elizabeth preferred stability over theatricality. Diamonds and pearls projected continuity. Emeralds often projected vanished empires. That distinction sounds subtle until you examine royal imagery carefully. The Queen spent decades crafting visual reassurance. Even her colour choices served visibility and symbolism. Nothing happened accidentally around her public presentation. Which is why the jewels she avoided reveal so much about the fears hidden beneath the polished surface of monarchy. And there were fears, real ones. Because by the late 20th century, questions surrounding colonial plunder began growing louder across museums, universities, and former territories of the British Empire. The debate over ownership of royal gemstones intensified year after year. the Koh-i-Noor diamond became the centre of international dispute. Historians revisited how imperial collections had been assembled in the first place. Suddenly, jewels once celebrated as trophies of empire became evidence in a global moral argument. Elizabeth understood the danger immediately. She never publicly addressed most of these controversies directly. That was not her style. But her actions inside the vault suggest careful awareness. Certain colonial-era jewels appeared less frequently. Some vanished from rotation entirely. Others were modified, downsized, or absorbed into less recognisable settings. Royal historians still debate how many pieces were quietly dismantled during the second half of the 20th century to reduce their political visibility. And honestly, that possibility is astonishing. Because if true, it means some of the most historic jewels on Earth were altered not by war or theft, but by strategic caution inside Buckingham Palace itself. The royal vault was never simply a storage room. It functioned more like a controlled archive of power, part museum, part battlefield, part psychological minefield. Beneath layers of velvet and bulletproof glass rested the emotional debris of centuries. Some jewels represented triumphs the monarchy still celebrated openly. Others carried memories so politically volatile that even mentioning them risked reopening old wounds. Elizabeth II spent 70 years navigating those dangers with astonishing discipline. And yet, despite all her caution, there were moments when forbidden jewels briefly escaped the shadows. Those moments were rare, but when they happened, they revealed far more than the palace intended. One of the strangest incidents occurred during the late 20th century, when several archive photographs surfaced, showing pieces that had virtually disappeared from public consciousness. Royal historians noticed immediately a sapphire necklace here, an enormous diamond stomacher there. Jewels unseen for decades suddenly reappeared in old negatives and forgotten press collections. Researchers began comparing inventory records against public appearances and discovered something deeply unusual. Entire categories of royal jewellery had effectively vanished during Elizabeth's reign. Not lost, removed. The distinction matters enormously. Jewels disappear naturally through inheritance disputes, theft, auction sales, and wartime chaos. But these pieces remained technically inside the royal collection. They were simply not worn, not photographed, not discussed, almost as though the monarchy itself had placed them into quarantine. And among palace insiders, one theory surfaced repeatedly. The Queen feared symbolism she could no longer control. That fear intensified during the 1980s and 1990s as public scrutiny of the monarchy became far harsher than earlier generations had experienced. Economic struggles widened class resentment. Television transformed royal life into constant spectacle. Then came the collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage, a disaster that shook the institution to its foundations. In that atmosphere, extravagant jewels became dangerous again. Every public appearance was dissected by newspapers. Every tiara invited commentary about wealth, privilege, and relevance. Elizabeth adapted instinctively. She leaned harder into familiar pearls, restrained brooches, and historically safe tiaras associated with continuity rather than conquest. Some of the grandest imperial pieces almost vanished from circulation altogether. And there is something quietly tragic about that, because many of these jewels were masterpieces of craftsmanship beyond anything modern ateliers could easily reproduce. Diamonds cut before electricity existed. Colombian emeralds carried across oceans under armed guard. Burmese rubies selected for queens who believed gemstones reflected divine authority. Entire generations of jewellers devoted their lives to creating these objects. Yet history changed around them so dramatically that their beauty itself became politically inconvenient. The Queen understood this better than almost anyone alive. One former royal correspondent recalled a private conversation with a palace official after a state banquet in the early 1990s. The official reportedly remarked that certain jewels had become too imperial for modern Britain. That phrase revealed everything. not ugly, not damaged, too imperial, meaning the monarchy itself recognised how public consciousness had shifted, and nowhere was that shift more explosive than around the jewels connected to India. The relationship between Britain and India haunted the Crown's jewellery collection constantly. Maharajas once competed for royal favour through extraordinary gemstone gifts. Diamonds, emeralds, and carved rubies entered British royal hands during the height of colonial rule. At the time, these exchanges were celebrated as symbols of alliance and imperial prestige. Decades later, they looked very different. By Elizabeth's reign, independence movements and post-colonial scholarship had transformed how many people viewed those treasures. Questions emerged that the monarchy could never answer comfortably. Were these jewels gifts freely given? Diplomatic obligations? Symbols of coercion hidden beneath ceremony? The deeper historians investigated imperial networks, the more complicated the answers became. So Elizabeth did what she often did best. She withdrew. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly. Certain Indian-associated pieces appeared less frequently over time. Others became nearly invisible. Palace staff never explained why, because explanation would require acknowledging the larger historical problem. Silence protected the institution better than debate ever could. But silence also created myth. And myths thrive inside royal history. Some of the rarest rumours surrounding the vault involve jewels allegedly shown only during private family gatherings or confidential fittings deep inside palace apartments. Former dressers spoke carefully about trays brought from restricted storage areas under heavy supervision. A few pieces reportedly carried internal warnings attached to them, notes explaining complicated provenance, diplomatic sensitivities, or family controversies associated with the stones. Official confirmation of such notes has never surfaced publicly. Still, the idea feels entirely believable, because Elizabeth II governed through information control. She revealed only what strengthened the monarchy. Everything else remained hidden behind ritual and silence. The forbidden jewels fit perfectly into that pattern. And then there was the matter of grief. This part of the story often goes unnoticed, but I think it explains more than politics alone ever could. Some jewels disappeared not because they were controversial publicly, but because they hurt privately. Prince Albert's death shattered Queen Victoria psychologically. Certain jewels became inseparable from mourning after his loss. Later generations inherited not just the gemstones, but the emotional weight attached to them. Similar patterns repeated across the royal family for decades. Jewels associated with dead children, failed marriages, abdications, betrayals, and humiliations acquired emotional gravity inside palace life. Elizabeth herself carried enormous private grief beneath her famously controlled exterior. The death of her father arrived early and violently through responsibility thrust upon her at 25. The destruction of family relationships during later decades wounded her deeply even when she refused public complaint. Prince Philip's death after more than 70 years beside her reportedly devastated the final period of her life. And in royal culture, grief often attaches itself to objects, especially jewels. A tiara worn during a disastrous wedding banquet may never feel neutral again. A brooch associated with scandal may become unbearable despite its value. Ordinary families experience this too, just on a smaller scale, but inside monarchy, memory hardens into ritual. Nothing is discarded emotionally. It is archived, preserved, locked away, exactly like the jewels themselves. By the final decades of Elizabeth II's reign, the royal collection had become something paradoxical, one of the most famous jewel assemblages on earth, and at the same time one of the least understood. Millions recognised the crowns, the state openings, the glittering banquet photographs. But very few understood how much had vanished behind the scenes. Absence became part of the monarchy's survival strategy. And nowhere was that strategy more visible than after the death of Diana Princess of Wales. The shock that followed the Paris crash in 1997 changed the monarchy permanently. Public anger erupted with a force Buckingham Palace had not anticipated. Crowds gathered outside the gates demanding emotional openness from an institution built on restraint. For several days, the royal family appeared dangerously disconnected from the grief-consuming Britain. Elizabeth eventually stabilised the crisis, but the lesson remained burned into palace thinking. Public perception could shift overnight. After Diana's death, displays of royal excess became even more carefully managed. Massive ceremonial jewels appeared less often outside strictly controlled state occasions. Palace advisors understood the optics immediately. Britain was entering a different era, more sceptical, more emotionally volatile, less patient with inherited privilege. The Queen adapted again. She always adapted. But adaptation came at a cost. Some of the most extraordinary pieces in the vault effectively disappeared from public life altogether during those years. Younger royals were loaned safer, softer jewels, pieces associated with elegance rather than imperial dominance. Delicate diamond bandeaus, floral tiaras, modest pearl settings. The towering constructions of empire remained mostly in darkness. And honestly, there is something haunting about that image. Because jewels are designed to be seen. Their entire existence depends on light. Diamonds sleeping unseen inside climate-controlled vaults almost feel unnatural, like musical instruments permanently locked in cases. Yet Elizabeth seemed increasingly willing to sacrifice visibility in exchange for stability. One royal archivist reportedly remarked that the Queen treated the collection like a diplomatic map. That comment explains more than most official biographies ever do. Every jewel carried risk calculations. Could it trigger criticism? Did it evoke colonial conquest? Did it remind the public of aristocratic excess during economic hardship? Did it connect to family scandal? If the answer became uncomfortable, the piece quietly disappeared from rotation. No speeches, no announcements, just silence. The silence surrounding the Grand Duchess Vladimir tiara illustrates this perfectly. Today, the tiara is famous largely because it survived revolution. Smuggled out of Russia after the Bolshevik collapse, the piece carried the drama of imperial survival itself. Elizabeth wore it many times throughout her reign, but even here she exercised remarkable caution. The tiara had interchangeable emeralds and pearls, radically changing its appearance depending on configuration. And people inside palace circles noticed something curious. The emerald version appeared less frequently over time. That detail sounds minor until you understand royal visual strategy. Emeralds projected old-world dynastic grandeur, dramatic, aristocratic, unmistakably imperial. Pearls projected continuity, dignity, and restraint. Elizabeth increasingly favoured the pearl setting, especially during politically sensitive periods. Even in one of the monarchy's most celebrated tiaras, the Queen seemed to soften historical sharpness whenever possible. She was constantly editing the visual language of monarchy. Constantly. Another jewel surrounded by mystery was the Nizam of Hyderabad necklace, one of the most expensive royal gifts ever received. Presented to Princess Elizabeth as a wedding gift in 1947 by the fabulously wealthy ruler of Hyderabad, the Cartier diamond necklace became legendary almost immediately. Technically, it was not forbidden. The Queen wore it occasionally. But compared to its extraordinary significance and beauty, public appearances remained surprisingly limited. Many historians believe the political transformation of India complicated the jewel's symbolism over time. The Nizam had once ruled one of the richest princely states under British imperial structure. After independence, those relationships became historically delicate. The necklace remained magnificent, but magnificence itself had become politically loaded. That tension defined Elizabeth's reign more than people realise. She inherited the remnants of an empire while trying to reinvent monarchy as service rather than domination. Jewels complicated that effort constantly because they were physical evidence of older power structures the modern crown preferred to soften or obscure. And then there were the pieces tied to personal humiliation. These are perhaps the saddest stories hidden inside the vault. Several royal biographers have hinted at jewels associated with marriages the palace considered painful failures. Pieces connected to Princess Margaret's heartbreak, jewels worn during catastrophic royal tours, brooches tied emotionally to family betrayals. Again, no official list exists. Royal archives protect such matters fiercely. But patterns emerge when examining decades of photographs carefully. Certain jewels vanish immediately after emotional crises, others never return after divorces. One striking example involved pieces frequently worn by the Queen Mother during periods of intense family strain in the mid-20th century. After her death, several highly recognisable jewels associated with her public identity appeared only sparingly despite their immense historical importance. Some historians suspect Elizabeth found them emotionally difficult to wear. Others believe palace advisors worried the pieces looked too connected to vanished imperial grandeur. Most likely, both explanations were true. Because emotion and politics constantly overlapped inside royal jewellery collections. That overlap becomes especially visible when examining jewels connected to Camilla. During the long and deeply controversial years surrounding Charles and Camilla's relationship, certain royal pieces became effectively untouchable. Palace staff reportedly feared inevitable comparisons to Diana if specific jewels appeared publicly on Camilla too early. Some items associated strongly with Diana were avoided almost entirely during sensitive periods. The monarchy understood symbolic warfare instinctively. A necklace could ignite headlines for weeks. A tiara could reopen old wounds across an entire nation. Elizabeth spent decades preventing exactly that kind of instability. And perhaps that is the strangest truth hidden beneath all the diamonds and velvet. The world imagined the Queen surrounded by limitless luxury. In reality, many of the most valuable objects she owned had become burdens she could barely use at all. By the early 2000s, the Forbidden Vault had acquired an almost mythological status among royal historians. Researchers traded fragments of information the way archaeologists exchange rumours about buried cities. A tiara spotted in a forgotten diplomatic photograph. A sapphire cluster listed in an inventory but absent from public records for 40 years. Court jewellers quietly restoring pieces no one had seen worn in generations. The collection existed in flashes, sudden reflections in old archives before darkness swallowed them again. And through all of it, Elizabeth II remained extraordinarily disciplined. She never fed the mystery publicly, never explained why certain jewels vanished, never defended the origins of controversial stones. The Queen understood something modern public figures often fail to grasp. Silence can become a form of power. The less the palace explained, the harder it became to challenge directly. Questions dissolved into speculation. Speculation faded into myth. But myths have a habit of surviving longer than official narratives. One of the most emotionally charged examples involved jewels connected to Queen Alexandra, the glamorous Danish-born queen consort of Edward VII. Alexandra adored extravagant jewellery. Layers of pearls climbed her neck almost constantly, partly for fashion and partly to conceal a surgical scar she hated being photographed. Her style reshaped aristocratic fashion across Europe. Yet behind the glamour lay anxiety, insecurity, and intense pressure to maintain royal perfection. Elizabeth inherited many pieces linked to Alexandra's image, and for long stretches she avoided them. The reason may seem subtle, but it reveals the Queen's extraordinary awareness of symbolism. Alexandra represented the old glittering world before World War I shattered Europe forever. A universe of imperial certainty, lavish aristocratic excess, and dynastic confidence. By Elizabeth's reign, that world had become historically dangerous to romanticise too openly. The monarchy could preserve its traditions, but it could not appear trapped in the fantasies of vanished empires. So certain jewels remained buried in history alongside the age that created them. I find that deeply melancholic. Because royal jewels are among the few surviving objects that physically witnessed entire civilizations changing around them. These stones watched empires expand, collapse, and disappear. They survived revolutions, bombings, assassinations, exile, and world wars. Yet the greatest threat to many of them was not destruction. It was irrelevance. Or worse, embarrassment. One palace advisor reportedly summarised the problem with brutal clarity during debates over royal presentation in the late 20th century. The public will forgive wealth more easily than arrogance. That sentence explains nearly every jewellery decision Elizabeth made during her reign. Wealth could be reframed as heritage. Arrogance could destroy monarchy itself. And some jewels projected arrogance too loudly to survive modern scrutiny. Few pieces embodied this dilemma more than the massive ceremonial necklaces associated with imperial state openings during the high colonial era. These constructions were staggering in scale, ropes of diamonds designed for candlelit courts, where monarchy needed to appear semi-divine. But television changed everything. Under modern cameras, such displays could appear less majestic than disconnected from reality. Elizabeth adapted by narrowing the visual distance between crown and public wherever possible. Smaller brooches, simpler daytime pearls, controlled restraint. It was strategic minimalism from one of the wealthiest women on earth. And still the vault remained full of objects too politically sensitive to discard and too controversial to celebrate openly. That contradiction haunted the monarchy constantly. The debate surrounding African gemstones intensified this pressure further. As former colonies revisited imperial history, scrutiny extended beyond famous diamonds like the Cullinan stones. Historians began tracing trade routes, mining conditions, and systems of extraction tied to colonial wealth. Jewellery collections, once treated as symbols of royal continuity, became evidence in broader arguments about exploitation and empire. The palace never fully solved this problem because there was no clean solution available. Return the jewels, and the monarchy risked unravelling centuries of legal and ceremonial precedent. Keep them visible, and criticism intensified. So Elizabeth often chose the middle path. Preserve quietly, display selectively, explain nothing. That strategy protected the institution for decades, but it also transformed parts of the royal collection into ghosts. Some pieces became so rarely seen that even experienced royal reporters occasionally doubted whether they remained intact. The Strathmore Rose tiara is a perfect example. Given originally as a wedding gift to the Queen Mother in the 1920s, the floral diamond tiara virtually disappeared for generations. Decades passed without public appearances. Historians speculated endlessly. Had it been dismantled, damaged, hidden intentionally? Then suddenly, after years of silence, it resurfaced, and the reaction was astonishing. Not because it was the largest tiara in the collection. It wasn't. Not because it contained the rarest diamonds. It didn't. The fascination came from disappearance itself. The tiara looked almost spectral, returning to public life after decades in darkness. Its absence had transformed it into legend. That is the strange alchemy of royal secrecy. The less visible a jewel becomes, the more powerfully people imagine it. Elizabeth understood this instinctively. Controlled rarity increased mystique. But there was another layer beneath the strategy, one rarely discussed openly. Age itself changed how the Queen approached the collection. As she grew older, Elizabeth became increasingly connected to memory through objects. Staff members noticed it in small details. Certain brooches worn repeatedly after Prince Philip's death, pieces associated with anniversaries or family milestones resurfacing during periods of private reflection. Jewellery became less theatrical and more intimate, and many forbidden jewels stayed forbidden because too many people connected to them were gone. Dead queens, dead empires, dead marriages, dead illusions about Britain's place in the world. The vault became crowded with emotional echoes. By the final years of her reign, Elizabeth II had outlived almost everyone who understood the original context behind many pieces. She herself had become the final living bridge to earlier eras of monarchy. Perhaps that is why some jewels vanished permanently under her watch. She knew exactly what histories they carried, because she had personally known people attached to them. That level of memory changes objects. A necklace stops being a necklace. It becomes a funeral, a betrayal, a warning. And in the silent rooms beneath Buckingham Palace, surrounded by locked steel and velvet darkness, the Queen spent decades deciding which histories the world was allowed to see, and which ones had to remain buried forever. There is a detail about the royal vault that almost never appears in official documentaries. The rooms are kept unnaturally cold, not freezing but cold enough to slow deterioration, to preserve silk linings, velvet trays, antique adhesives, fragile settings, old gold alloys. Curators move carefully because many of the jewels are centuries old and irreplaceable. Some diamonds were mounted before electricity existed. Some clasps were engineered for queens who travelled by horse carriage beneath torchlight. The collection is not simply valuable, it is fragile. That fragility mirrors the monarchy itself more than the palace would ever admit publicly. Because by the 21st century, Elizabeth II was protecting not only jewels, but the illusion of permanence surrounding the crown. And permanence is difficult to maintain when history keeps exposing uncomfortable truths buried beneath ceremonial splendour. One of the most controversial examples centred around the Cullinan diamonds, the enormous stones cut from the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever discovered. Several major fragments became part of the crown jewels themselves. Others entered royal brooches and ceremonial ornaments worn by Elizabeth throughout her reign. To many in Britain, they symbolised continuity and national heritage. To critics, especially in parts of Africa, they represented extraction under colonial power structures that heavily favoured Imperial Britain. The Queen never publicly addressed those criticisms directly. Again, silence. But silence did not mean ignorance. Palace advisers monitored these debates closely, especially as international pressure around repatriation intensified in museums worldwide. Curators understood that jewels once celebrated uncritically were now being re-examined through moral and political lenses unimaginable during Queen Victoria's reign. Elizabeth adapted by using some pieces with increasing caution, especially outside highly controlled ceremonial contexts, and here the emotional complexity becomes almost impossible to untangle cleanly. Because Elizabeth genuinely loved history. People who worked around her repeatedly described her astonishing memory for objects, dates, and family associations. She could identify provenance details most people would need archives to verify. She remembered which queen wore which brooch during specific diplomatic events decades earlier. The jewels were not abstractions to her. They were part of a living historical bloodstream connecting centuries of monarchy. Yet history itself was changing around her. The meanings attached to the jewels were changing too. That tension surfaced dramatically during debates over the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Few gemstones on earth carry more controversy. Seized amid conquest, passed through empires, embedded eventually into the British crown jewels, the diamond became a symbol far larger than itself. Calls for its return intensified repeatedly during Elizabeth's reign, especially from India, and noticeably, the Queen herself never wore it. Technically, the diamond belonged to crown regalia associated with Queen's consort, not reigning queens, but symbolism mattered more than technicality. Palace strategists understood the explosive optics surrounding the stone. Public use became increasingly delicate as post-colonial criticism expanded globally. What had once been presented as imperial glory now risked appearing as triumphalism built upon conquest. So the diamond remained mostly trapped inside ceremonial ritual rather than personal royal imagery. Contained, restricted, almost quarantined by history itself. And perhaps that is the defining pattern of Elizabeth's forbidden vault. jewels transformed from symbols of unquestioned power into liabilities requiring careful containment. The transformation was psychological as much as political. One former royal protection officer later recalled how seriously jewel logistics were treated during overseas tours. Routes changed constantly. Display schedules remained confidential. Security assessments evaluated not only theft risks, but political reactions. In certain countries, specific historical pieces were avoided entirely to prevent diplomatic controversy. Even gemstones had become geopolitical actors. That fact still amazes me. A necklace could threaten negotiations. A tiara could reopen colonial resentment. A brooch could trigger headlines across continents. Elizabeth understood this world instinctively, because she had spent her entire life inside systems of symbolic meaning. Few modern leaders ever operated under such relentless visual scrutiny. Every photograph of the Queen became historical documentation instantly. Every jewel choice entered public interpretation. Over decades, she developed an almost surgical precision in presentation, and yet some pieces remained too dangerous even for her. The Burmese ruby tiara reveals another layer of this hidden history. Created for Elizabeth using rubies gifted by the people of Burma, the tiara carried traditional symbolism associated with protection against evil and illness. On paper, it sounded ideal for royal mythology, dramatic, historic, meaningful. But its visual effect was startlingly severe. The sharp ruby flames rising from the diamonds gave the tiara an intensity bordering on aggressive. Unlike softer floral designs favoured in later decades, the Burmese ruby tiara looked confrontational, powerful, almost militant under certain lighting conditions. Elizabeth wore it occasionally, particularly during periods when stronger imagery suited the monarchy, but compared to more familiar tiaras, it remained relatively uncommon. Some royal historians suspect the piece projected a harder image than the palace preferred during an era increasingly focused on accessibility and emotional warmth. Again, symbolism controlled everything. And symbolism became even more sensitive after fires, scandals, and financial crises battered the monarchy during the 1990s. Windsor Castle burned in 1992. Public fury erupted over restoration funding. Charles and Diana separated. Andrew and Sarah Ferguson collapsed publicly. Princess Anne divorced. The Queen herself privately referred to the period as her annus horribilis. During moments like that, extravagant jewels could become visual gasoline thrown onto public frustration, so restraint deepened. There is a revealing contrast in photographs from different decades of Elizabeth's reign. In the 1950s and early 1960s, state appearances often embraced fuller ceremonial grandeur. Multiple orders, elaborate necklaces, immense tiaras blazing beneath chandeliers. By the later decades, despite still wearing magnificent pieces, the Queen frequently appeared more controlled, more measured, visually simplified. It was not accidental aging, it was adaptation for survival. The Forbidden Vault grew larger because modern monarchy demanded invisibility from certain parts of its own history. And perhaps nowhere was that more painful than in relation to family itself. Some jewels vanished because Elizabeth could no longer separate them from heartbreak. Staff close to the Queen reportedly observed how rarely she revisited pieces strongly associated with Diana after the princess's death. Certain sapphires became emotionally loaded beyond public understanding. The same happened with jewels tied closely to Princess Margaret after her decline and death. Objects absorb emotional gravity over time, especially inside families burdened by ritual memory. Royal jewels are never emotionally neutral. Every tiara has witnessed arguments no cameras saw. Every brooch survived funerals hidden behind palace walls. Every necklace passed through hands now buried beneath stone chapels and royal tombs. And Elizabeth carried all of that memory longer than anyone expected possible. By the time Elizabeth II entered the final chapter of her reign, The royal jewel collection no longer resembled the triumphant imperial treasury inherited from Queen Mary or Queen Victoria. The physical objects remained, but their meaning had shifted dramatically. Some pieces had become too politically volatile for ordinary use. Others were emotionally contaminated by family tragedy. A few had simply become impossible to display without reopening arguments about empire, privilege, and power. And still the vault remained full. That contradiction is essential to understanding Elizabeth herself, because despite her extraordinary wealth, she spent much of her reign limiting how visibly that wealth could appear. The monarchy survived not through display alone, but through careful calibration between grandeur and restraint. Too little magnificence, and the institution lost mystique. Too much, and it risked looking grotesquely detached from modern life. The Queen walked that line with almost frightening precision. One royal photographer once remarked that Elizabeth understood camera symbolism better than many politicians. She knew exactly how diamonds reacted beneath television lighting. She knew when a tiara looked majestic and when it looked excessive. She understood the emotional effect of pearls during mourning periods and the authority projected by sapphires during diplomatic ceremonies. None of it was random, which makes the hidden jewels even more revealing, because every piece she refused to wear was effectively a silent decision about history itself. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara offers a fascinating example. Today it is strongly associated with Diana and later Catherine, Princess of Wales, but during Elizabeth's reign, the piece occupied emotionally dangerous territory. Diana transformed the tiara into one of the most recognisable royal images of the late 20th century. After her death, the jewel practically disappeared for years. Officially, nothing prevented its use. Unofficially, the emotional atmosphere surrounding it became suffocating. The public would not have seen merely diamonds. They would have seen Diana's suffering. That is the burden hidden inside royal collections. Objects absorb narrative until they become inseparable from human memory. Elizabeth understood this profoundly. She knew certain jewels could summon grief instantly across an entire nation, so they waited in darkness. And there is something almost eerie about imagining these pieces sitting silently beneath Buckingham Palace while history outside kept changing. Governments rose and collapsed. The Cold War ended. The internet transformed public life. Britain argued over identity, empire, Brexit, modernity. Through all of it, inside climate-controlled rooms below the palace, diamonds cut for vanished empresses still rested untouched in velvet compartments. A private museum of unresolved history. One of the most striking realities about the Forbidden Vault is that many controversial jewels were never officially banned at all. The monarchy rarely operates through explicit prohibitions. Instead, it relies on softer mechanisms: preference, custom, strategic avoidance. A tiara simply stops appearing. A necklace quietly remains in storage. Younger royals are guided towards safer alternatives. Over time, absence hardens into unofficial policy, and unofficial policy can become stronger than written rules. Former palace insiders occasionally hinted at how these decisions unfolded. Senior dressers, private secretaries, royal archivists, and jewel custodians all participated in maintaining symbolic discipline. Discussions before major state events reportedly involved astonishing detail. Which tiara suited the diplomatic mood? Which gemstones might provoke criticism abroad? Which family associations should be avoided during sensitive anniversaries? The monarchy curated itself constantly. That curation intensified enormously during the age of mass media. Earlier kings and queens existed at a distance from ordinary life. Elizabeth lived under permanent global observation. A single photograph could circle the world within hours. Every visual detail became open to interpretation. Under those conditions, jewels stopped being decorative and became strategic communications tools. And some messages were simply too dangerous to send. The most emotionally devastating category involved jewels connected to women the monarchy believed had suffered under royal life itself. Diana was the most famous example, but not the only one. Princess Margaret's glamour gradually curdled into loneliness and illness. Wallis Simpson became permanently exiled from the institution she helped fracture. Even earlier figures like Queen Alexandra and Empress Marie Feodorovna carried stories of personal isolation beneath their dazzling public images. Elizabeth inherited their jewels along with their ghosts. That may sound poetic, but inside royal culture it was almost literal. Memory attached itself to objects with astonishing intensity. Staff remembered who wore specific brooches during family crises, which tiara appeared at disastrous state dinners, which necklace accompanied funeral processions. The collection became emotionally mapped over generations, and Elizabeth carried those maps in her mind until the end. People often describe her as emotionally reserved. I think that interpretation misses something important. The restraint was real, but beneath it existed enormous emotional discipline rather than emotional emptiness. She compartmentalized feelings because monarchy demanded it. The jewels reveal this more clearly than almost anything else. Instead of publicly discussing painful histories, she quietly controlled their visibility. That was her language. Silence, selection, absence. Even the jewels she continued wearing regularly reflected this instinct toward controlled continuity. Pearls became almost armour-like in their consistency. Familiar brooches returned repeatedly because familiarity itself reassured the public. The Queen understood that repetition creates stability. In uncertain times, predictable symbols calm people. Forbidden jewels disrupted that stability. They carried too much unresolved tension. And toward the very end of her reign, another subtle shift occurred. Younger royals slowly began accessing pieces hidden for decades. Tiaras unseen for generations resurfaced. Archivists started releasing older photographs more openly. The collection itself seemed to breathe again after years of cautious containment. But even then, some pieces remained absent. Still locked away, still too sensitive, too imperial, too painful, too politically radioactive for modern monarchy. That phrase returns again and again because it explains everything. The Forbidden Vault was never truly about beauty. Some of the hidden jewels were among the greatest masterpieces ever created. What made them dangerous was meaning. History had changed around them so dramatically that they no longer communicated what the Crown wanted the public to see. And Elizabeth II, perhaps more than any monarch before her, understood the terrifying power of symbolism. In the end, that may be her real legacy regarding the royal jewels, not the diamonds themselves, not the crowns, not even the famous tiaras blazing beneath palace chandeliers. Her real legacy was control. She inherited one of the most controversial treasure collections on Earth and spent 70 years managing which fragments of history the world could safely witness. Some jewels became icons. Others became ghosts sealed beneath Buckingham Palace, sleeping in darkness among velvet trays and steel doors, carrying stories the monarchy still does not fully dare to tell. By the last years of her life, Elizabeth II was no longer just the custodian of the crown jewels. She had become something closer to their final interpreter, the only remaining person who still understood, from lived experience, why so many of them had been silenced. Inside the palace, time does not feel linear. It accumulates. Archives grow heavier. Objects outlive the people who once gave them meaning. By this stage, Elizabeth had outlived almost an entire generation of courtiers, jewellers, private secretaries, and historians who had worked on the collection in its mid-20th century form. With their passing, context began to thin. What remained were objects stripped of explanation, preserved only by inventory numbers and institutional memory. And that is where the true strangeness begins. Because when context disappears, jewels stop being history and start becoming enigmas. Some of the pieces that remained locked away were not even especially controversial in a modern sense. They were simply too entangled in private royal life to circulate comfortably. A brooch worn repeatedly during King George VI's final illness. A necklace associated with Princess Margaret's most publicly painful years. A diamond ornament linked to a diplomatic scandal long since buried in state archives. Individually, none of these objects were dangerous. Together, they formed an emotional geography the Queen had spent decades carefully navigating. And she knew exactly what would happen if that geography was reopened without care. Public fascination would turn instantly into interpretation. Interpretation would harden into narrative. And narrative, once formed around monarchy, is extremely difficult to correct. One of the most telling aspects of Elizabeth's later reign was how rarely she allowed dramatic recontextualization of older royal imagery. Even when fashion shifted toward nostalgia for historic pieces, she remained selective. Some jewels reappeared briefly, almost experimentally, then retreated again into storage. Others never re-emerged at all. This was not forgetfulness, it was containment. Royal archives contain references to what are described by some researchers as restricted sentimental assets, pieces that require additional approval layers before use in official contexts. While the term sounds bureaucratic, its implication is deeply human. It suggests that certain objects carry emotional weight strong enough to warrant institutional control. And jewels, perhaps more than anything else in royal life, accumulate that weight over time. There is a reason historians often describe the crown jewels as a living collection. Unlike paintings or sculptures, they are meant to be worn. They move across bodies, they participate in ceremony, they appear in photographs that define eras. Each appearance binds them to specific political moments, and those moments never fully disappear. Elizabeth understood this accumulation of meaning better than anyone. That is why she treated repetition as carefully as innovation. Reusing familiar jewels created continuity across decades of rapid change. A sapphire brooch worn in the 1950s might reappear in the 2000s, subtly linking vastly different political worlds under a single visual thread. This continuity helped stabilise the monarchy's image during periods of upheaval. But continuity has a shadow side, because repeated visibility also highlights absence. When certain jewels never return, people begin to notice. And in the digital age, noticing becomes global. By the 2000s, online communities of historians, enthusiasts, and archivists began cataloguing royal appearances with almost forensic precision. Every tiara, every necklace, every brooch was tracked, compared, and analysed across decades of photographs. Gaps became visible in a way they never were before. Entire categories of jewels seem to have disappeared from modern usage. The term forbidden vault began circulating in popular discussion, even though no official institution ever used it. And yet, the phrase captured something real. Not a literal locked chamber of cursed objects, but a structured absence, a curated invisibility maintained through decades of careful royal decision-making. Elizabeth's role in this system was not authoritarian in a cinematic sense. There were no proclamations forbidding jewels. Instead, there was a continuous process of selection shaped by advisors, tradition, historical sensitivity, and the Queen's own instincts. Over time, this process created the effect of prohibition without explicit bans. A softer kind of control, one that leaves almost no documentary trace. Even within the palace, explanations were rarely recorded in detail. Decisions were understood rather than written. This is partly tradition and partly practicality. Monarchies survive through discretion. The less that is documented about sensitive symbolic choices, the less there is to later politicise. But history has a way of reconstructing silence, and reconstruction often produces myth. Some of the most persistent myths around the royal jewels involve claims of secret alterations, pieces dismantled to avoid political controversy, stones reset into less recognisable forms, heirlooms redistributed quietly among branches of the family. While definitive evidence for large-scale restructuring remains limited, it is widely accepted among historians that modification and adaptation of jewellery over time is normal within royal collections. What remains uncertain is scale, and that uncertainty is precisely what fuels fascination. Because the idea that a jewel can disappear without vanishing, that it can be transformed, hidden, or repurposed while still technically existing, blurs the line between history and secrecy. Elizabeth II governed in that blurred space. She inherited an empire already in transformation and presided over its final symbolic transition into a modern constitutional monarchy. The jewels were part of that transition whether they were worn or not. Some became public icons of continuity, others became private relics of an earlier political world. And a few, perhaps the most politically sensitive, simply stopped appearing at all, not erased, not destroyed, just held in reserve as if waiting for a version of history that would never quite return. In that sense, the Forbidden Vault is not a place. It is a decision repeated over decades, a decision about what the world is allowed to see and what must remain indefinitely in the dark. What remained in the deepest layers of the vault was no longer simply a collection of jewels. It had become a catalogue of decisions stretching across 70 years, each one shaped by politics, grief, diplomacy, and the slow rewriting of Britain's identity. By this stage of Elizabeth II's reign, even the act of opening certain storage cases reportedly required heightened authorization, not because of physical danger, but because of symbolic risk. A single tray could contain pieces linked to multiple eras at once: imperial ceremony, wartime austerity, post-war reconstruction, decolonization, modern media scrutiny. The same diamonds could mean victory in one decade and controversy in another. That instability is what made the collection so difficult to complete in any narrative sense. There was no final version of the crown jewels, only shifting visibility. One former royal aide, speaking in carefully neutral terms years later, described the system as rotation under constraint. Jewels were not simply chosen for beauty or tradition. They were rotated in and out of public life based on layered considerations: historical sensitivity, diplomatic context, family circumstance, even the emotional state of the monarch herself. That last factor is rarely acknowledged, but it matters, because Elizabeth was not detached from the objects she managed. She had grown up watching them being worn by her grandmother and mother. She had seen them associated with coronations, funerals, wars, and recoveries. By the time she became queen, she did not perceive them as static artifacts. She perceived them as participants in history, and participants can become problematic, especially when history changes direction. One of the most illustrative cases in the later period involves the shift in how royal imagery was used for international diplomacy. During the mid to late 20th century, state visits became increasingly choreographed visual events. The jewels worn at banquets or receptions were no longer just ceremonial. They were interpreted as signals of relationship strength, continuity, or subtle distance. A sapphire suite might project stability with Commonwealth partners. Pearls might emphasize mourning, neutrality, or restraint during sensitive geopolitical moments. Diamonds, depending on context, could suggest either celebration or excess. Elizabeth mastered this language fluently. But fluency does not eliminate risk, because every interpretation exists outside the control of the wearer. And by the late 20th century, interpretation had escaped the palace entirely. Media analysis, academic critique, and public commentary had turned royal jewellery into a global decoding exercise. What once required court knowledge was now discussed in newspapers, television segments, and eventually online forums. The symbolic system became unstable simply because too many people were interpreting it at once. That instability pushed certain jewels further into silence, not because they lost relevance, but because they gained too many conflicting meanings. One particularly sensitive category involved pieces connected to pre-war European monarchies that had collapsed in the early 20th century. These jewels carried layered associations with exile, revolution, and vanished dynasties. In earlier eras, they functioned as reminders of royal continuity across borders. In modern contexts, they risked evoking nostalgia for political systems that no longer existed. Elizabeth, who had personally met many exiled royal relatives during her lifetime, understood how emotionally charged those associations could become, so their visibility declined. Another category involved jewels tied to wartime Britain. Pieces worn during the Blitz or during major wartime broadcasts carried immense emotional weight for older generations but increasingly distant resonance for younger audiences. What once symbolized resilience risked becoming historical abstraction, or worse, unintentionally romanticized suffering. This is one of the quieter tensions inside long-lived institutions. Memory is not static, it ages, it reinterprets itself, and objects anchored in memory must either adapt or retreat. Many of the jewels simply retreated, and in their retreat they became something unusual, historically present but visually absent. The palace did not frame this as suppression, it framed it as stewardship, preservation of dignity, protection of meaning, avoidance of misinterpretation. But the effect was the same. Entire visual chapters of monarchy became inaccessible to the public eye. Even within royal photography archives, researchers occasionally encounter gaps that are difficult to explain through simple wear and tear or routine selection. Years where certain high-value pieces appear absent from state imagery. Decades where particular tiaras seem statistically underrepresented compared to earlier periods. These patterns are subtle but consistent enough to draw scholarly attention. And yet, no definitive internal document explains them. That absence of explanation is itself part of the system. Because monarchy does not rely on transparency in the way modern institutions often do. It relies on continuity of practice. If something is no longer shown, it gradually ceases to exist in public imagination. If it is not discussed, it becomes less urgent to question. Over time, silence replaces policy, and silence is remarkably durable. By the final years of Elizabeth II's reign, that silence had accumulated into something almost architectural. The vault beneath Buckingham Palace was still physically full of extraordinary jewels, but culturally it was increasingly segmented into visible and invisible worlds. Visible jewels formed the public monarchy. Coronations, state openings, official portraits. Invisible jewels formed everything else. History too complex, too emotionally charged, or too politically sensitive to circulate. The boundary between those two worlds was never officially drawn, but it was deeply understood. And perhaps the most haunting realization is this: nothing in the invisible category was ever declared less valuable. Some of the most breathtaking pieces remained unseen, not because they were forgotten, but because they were remembered too well. In the end, The Forbidden Vault is not a story about loss. It is a story about control under pressure, about how an ancient institution learned to manage meaning in an age that no longer accepts inherited symbolism at face value. And beneath all the diamonds, beneath all the crowns and ceremonial gold, there is a quieter truth that defines everything. The jewels did not disappear. They were simply asked to stop speaking. In the final stretch of Elizabeth II's life, the monarchy itself began to feel like an archive being carefully closed and reopened at the same time. Public ceremonies continued with precision, but behind the scenes there was an increasing awareness that every object, every tradition, every jewel now existed under a different kind of scrutiny than in any previous reign. Nothing about the collection had changed physically in any dramatic way. The diamonds had not dimmed. The tiaras had not lost their craftsmanship. The emeralds, rubies, and sapphires remained as vivid as when they first entered royal possession centuries earlier. What changed was the environment around them, the moral, political, and cultural framework that determined how they were seen. And perception is everything in monarchy. By this stage, even long-established traditions of royal jewellery use were being quietly reassessed, not formally abandoned, but gently rebalanced. Some pieces appeared less frequently, not because they were banned, but because their historical associations had become harder to reconcile with modern public expectations. Others were reserved for highly specific ceremonial contexts where their meaning could be carefully controlled. This is where Elizabeth's approach becomes especially revealing. She did not dismantle the symbolism of the crown jewels. She curated it, carefully, continuously, almost invisibly. One of the most significant aspects of this period was the increasing separation between heritage display and active symbolism. Heritage display meant presenting jewels as historical artifacts linked to coronations, royal weddings, or state anniversaries. Active symbolism meant using jewels as living diplomatic language in real time. Elizabeth gradually reduced the second category, not to diminish the monarchy, but to stabilise it, because active symbolism carries risk. A single misunderstood appearance can become global commentary within hours. A tiara worn at the wrong moment can be interpreted as tone deaf. A necklace seen as overly extravagant during economic difficulty can trigger backlash. The Queen understood that in the age of instant communication, symbolic precision had to be higher than ever. So the system tightened. And tightening systems always create shadow zones. Within those shadow zones, certain jewels effectively entered long-term suspension, not erased from existence, not removed from the royal inventory, but withdrawn from the cycle of public meaning. They remained physically preserved, but culturally paused, as though waiting for a historical context that no longer aligned with contemporary reality. This is one of the most important truths about the so-called Forbidden Vault. It was not a fixed list of banned objects. It was a fluid boundary that shifted with time, public sentiment, and political sensitivity. A jewel could move in and out of visibility depending on circumstance, but some never returned. And those are the ones that acquired mythic status. The human mind struggles with absence inside systems that are otherwise meticulously documented. The crown jewels are photographed, catalogued, insured, and historically recorded in extraordinary detail. So when something is missing from public rotation, people naturally assume concealment rather than simple choice. Over time, absence becomes narrative becomes speculation, and speculation becomes legend. Elizabeth, experienced in all forms of public interpretation, likely understood this dynamic better than anyone. Which raises a quiet question historians still return to. Was some of the silence intentional, not just for protection, but for mystique? There is no definitive answer. But monarchy has always understood the value of controlled mystery. Another layer emerged in the late period that is often overlooked: generational transition. As younger members of the royal family began assuming more visible public roles, the question of which jewels they would inherit, and which they would be allowed to wear, became increasingly relevant. This is where continuity becomes complicated, because inheritance does not automatically equal usability. A jewel may pass into possession while remaining emotionally or symbolically unsuitable for public appearance. Family memory, public association, and media history all influence whether a piece can re-enter circulation. This means the Queen was not only managing the present, she was effectively deciding the future visibility of the entire collection. Some jewels were clearly positioned for eventual reuse by younger royals, others were not, and that distinction was never publicly explained. One of the most striking aspects of Elizabeth's late reign is how much emphasis was placed on continuity imagery during major public moments. Brooches associated with earlier queens reappeared more frequently. Familiar tiaras were favoured in high-profile portraits. The visual language of monarchy became intentionally stable, almost reassuringly repetitive. But beneath that surface continuity, the invisible collection remained vast and increasingly quiet. There is a certain emotional weight in that silence, not dramatic, not theatrical, but slow, cumulative, architectural. It builds over time until absence itself becomes part of the institution's identity. In that sense, the Forbidden Vault is less a physical place and more a historical condition. It is what remains when visibility becomes selective enough to reshape memory. And memory, once reshaped, rarely returns to its original form. By the end of Elizabeth II's reign, the crown jewels still functioned as they always had, symbols of monarchy, authority, and continuity. But they also functioned as something more complex, a carefully managed record of what Britain chooses to remember publicly and what it chooses to keep just out of sight. Some of those choices were political, some were emotional, many were both at once. And inside that overlap, between history and restraint, between display and omission, the silent collection continued to exist, unchanged in form, but transformed entirely in meaning. Not lost, not forgotten, simply held back from view as if the past itself required permission to be seen. Then the vault stops feeling like a collection and becomes something more precise, a sequence of sealed biographies written in gold and stone. Each jewel carries its own gravity. Each one has a reason it never returned to public rotation during Elizabeth II's reign. Not officially banned, never formally condemned, just withheld, as if the institution itself had learned that certain objects speak too loudly for the modern age. And the first of these silent objects is not famous in the way crowns are famous. It survives instead in fragments of records and in the guarded language of former court inventories. The Greville Honeycomb Suite, a set of diamond jewellery created by Cartier in the 1920s, commissioned for Dame Margaret Greville, one of the most influential social figures of her time. On paper, it is a masterpiece of geometric precision. Hexagonal diamond patterns forming a structure so delicate it looks almost architectural, as if jewellery had been built rather than crafted. But what made it politically sensitive inside the royal collection was not its beauty, it was its context. Margaret Greville was not royalty. She was wealth translated into access. A woman who moved comfortably through the highest corridors of aristocratic influence during the final decades of empire. Her jewels were acquired in an era when imperial trade networks still functioned without the moral questions that would later define them. And Elizabeth II inherited not just the suite, but the historical shadow attached to it. The honeycomb pieces occasionally appeared in early photographs of the Queen Mother. Later, they began to disappear from circulation almost entirely. No public announcement, no official explanation, just a slow withdrawal into storage, where they remained for decades. What makes this suite particularly striking is not that it is hidden. It is that it is perfectly preserved, yet rarely spoken of. Former royal jewellery specialists have hinted that its design, so explicitly tied to elite interwar luxury, made it increasingly difficult to present in a modern context where monarchy was expected to appear restrained, even approachable. I find that detail almost unsettling. Because nothing about the diamonds themselves changed, only the world did. And the next jewel carries an even heavier silence. The Cambridge Emerald Parure emeralds of extraordinary depth, originally part of Queen Mary's extensive collection, passed down through generations of royal inheritance. Unlike many pieces designed for singular ceremonial impact, this parure was modular: necklaces, earrings, brooches, and tiaras that could be assembled or separated depending on occasion. In earlier decades, it represented continuity across European royal houses. Emeralds like these were not just decorative, they were dynastic language. They connected the British crown to the wider aristocratic network of old Europe. But by the late 20th century, that symbolism had changed completely. Europe itself had changed. Empires had collapsed. Monarchies had been reduced, redefined, or erased. what once looked like continuity began to resemble a relic of vanished political architecture. And so the Cambridge emeralds began to retreat from visibility. Not abruptly, not dramatically, slowly, almost politely. Elizabeth II wore them rarely compared to other major jewels, despite their extraordinary craftsmanship. In archival photographs, they appear like guests who no longer attend the same events as everyone else. There is something deeply melancholic about that absence, because emeralds are not quiet stones. They are designed to command attention, deep green fire under palace light, heavy with historical weight. And yet here they are, reduced to memory management. Some historians suggest the issue was not aesthetic at all, but symbolic fatigue. Too many associations with vanished courts, imperial ceremonies, and pre-war aristocratic Europe made them difficult to integrate into a monarchy trying to project modern stability. So they remained inside the vault more often than not, waiting, unworn history, the Nizam of Hyderabad necklace. This piece is different in tone entirely, less European, more global. A Cartier masterpiece composed of diamonds presented as a wedding gift to Princess Elizabeth in 1947 by the Nizam of Hyderabad, one of the richest rulers in the world at the time. It is, by any measure, overwhelming in its brilliance. Layered diamond structures that sit not as decoration but as declaration. A jewel created at the intersection of diplomacy, wealth, and imperial transition. And that last word is where the tension begins, because 1947 was not just a year of celebration, it was a rupture. The partition of India, the end of British imperial authority in the region, and the transformation of political relationships that had once made such gifts routine. The necklace survived, but its context did not. During Elizabeth II's reign, it appeared only occasionally, despite its status as a personal gift and its undeniable craftsmanship. Each appearance carried a quiet awareness of historical sensitivity, a reminder that what once symbolised diplomatic closeness now sat inside a far more complicated narrative of post-colonial history. There is no record of it being forbidden, but its rarity tells its own story. A jewel does not need to be banned to disappear. It only needs to become difficult to explain. And this is where the pattern becomes unmistakable. Each of these pieces, the honeycomb suite, the Cambridge emeralds, the Hyderabad necklace, is not hidden for the same reason. There is no single rule inside the vault. There is only accumulation. Accumulation of history, accumulation of interpretation, accumulation of emotional and political weight that builds until visibility itself becomes a decision requiring justification. Elizabeth II did not erase these jewels. She filtered them through time. And time, more than any monarch, decides what can still be shown without consequence. The Vladimir tiara, the adaptable crown that stopped being simple. Among all the objects inside the royal collection, few are as visually fluid, or historically loaded, as the Grand Duchess Vladimir tiara. At first glance, it seems almost flexible in its identity. A lattice of diamonds, constructed in Russia for the Romanov court, later smuggled out after revolution and ultimately absorbed into the British royal collection. It is not a single fixed design, but a system. It can hold pearls, it can hold emerald drops, it can shift appearance depending on what is attached to it. And that adaptability is precisely what made it politically sensitive in Elizabeth II's era. Because adaptability, in monarchy, is never neutral. In earlier generations, this tiara represented survival, the ability of European royal objects to outlive revolutions. But by the late 20th century, survival narratives themselves had become complicated. The Romanovs were no longer just a fallen dynasty. They were a symbol of violent rupture, exile, and political collapse on a scale that modern audiences interpreted very differently. And so something subtle happened. The Vladimir tiara did not disappear. It changed personality depending on how it was used. The pearl version became the safe version, softer, more neutral, more aligned with modern ceremonial expectations. The emerald version, by contrast, carried a sharper, almost imperial intensity. Under palace lighting, it looked less like jewellery and more like a fragment of a vanished political order. And over time, that distinction mattered, because Elizabeth II increasingly favoured emotional neutrality and high-visibility state imagery. Not absence of grandeur, but control over its temperature. What is striking is not that the tiara remained in use, it is that its most politically charged variations appeared less frequently in later decades. No announcement marked this shift. No internal directive was made public. But royal photography archives quietly show patterns that historians have noted for years. Long gaps between appearances, changes in configuration, and careful selection of which version would be used for which diplomatic moment. I find that detail revealing in a way that is almost uncomfortable, because it shows that even within a single object, meaning could be adjusted like a dial. And then there is the silence around its Russian origin. A silence not of denial, but of avoidance. In a world increasingly sensitive to the history of imperial collapse and aristocratic exile, the Romanov connection became something the palace rarely emphasised in public narratives. The tiara remained, but its story became less central in official descriptions. It was presented as craftsmanship, not as political memory. But history is never erased that easily. It simply moves into the background of interpretation. The Delhi Durbar necklace, a ceremony that outgrew its own jewels. If the Vladimir tiara represents European collapse and adaptation, then the Delhi Durbar necklace represents something even more difficult for modern monarchy to navigate: imperial spectacle. Created for the 1911 Delhi Durbar, a ceremony designed to display British imperial authority in India at its height, this necklace was not designed to be subtle. It was designed to be seen from distance, under intense ceremonial conditions, as part of a wider visual language of dominance. Large diamonds, structural weight, a sense of formality that feels almost architectural rather than decorative. In its original context, it made sense. In Elizabeth II's context, it became complicated, because by her reign, the empire that produced such objects no longer existed. What remained was memory, and memory had changed its emotional tone. The necklace itself did not lose beauty. It lost interpretive stability. And that is a crucial distinction inside the royal vault. Elizabeth II reportedly wore pieces from this broader Durbar-era collection rarely and always within tightly controlled ceremonial settings, never casually, never in ways that might invite uncontrolled commentary. It was not rejection, it was containment, because in a modern media environment, a jewel born from imperial ceremony cannot appear without being interpreted through imperial history. And that interpretation is no longer uniform, it is contested. For the monarchy, contested meaning is far more dangerous than silence, so silence becomes the safer choice. The Greville ruby brooches, private emotion disguised as public decoration. Not all forbidden jewels are politically sensitive in the imperial sense. Some are emotionally sensitive in a far more intimate way. The Greville ruby brooches fall into that category. Gifted from the same Greville estate that supplied so many extraordinary pieces to the royal family, these brooches are smaller, more wearable, and far less visually overwhelming than tiaras or necklaces. And yet their history is deeply embedded in the emotional fabric of royal life during the 20th century. They were frequently associated with Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and later they became associated with absence. After her death, several pieces that had been visually familiar to the public during her lifetime became noticeably less frequent in appearances, not removed, not discarded, simply less present. This is where royal jewellery becomes something almost psychological, because these objects are not just symbols of monarchy, they are reminders of people, and reminders can become difficult to carry forward unchanged. Elizabeth II was known for emotional restraint in public, but within the structure of monarchy, restraint often translates into curation. Certain objects become too closely tied to individual memory to be worn casually by others, not because of protocol, but because of perception. And perception, again, is everything. A brooch is never just a brooch when it is recognised by millions of people as belonging to someone who is no longer alive. So it returns to the vault, quietly, without explanation, and here the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Each jewel carries a different reason for its silence. One is political history, one is imperial symbolism, one is emotional association. But the result is always the same: withdrawal from visibility. Not destruction, not scandal, just absence shaped by caution. Elizabeth II did not preside over a vault of forbidden jewels in the sense of prohibition. She presided over a vault of managed meanings, where every object remained intact, but not every object remained usable. And over time, that distinction created something extraordinary: a collection that is physically complete, but historically fragmented in public view. A monarchy that still owns its entire past, but chooses carefully which parts of it are allowed to appear in the present. The Greville Emerald Kokoshnik, the jewel that looked too loud for a quiet century. There is a moment in royal photography where a single object can dominate everything else in the frame, not because it is largest, but because it refuses to be visually silent. The Greville Emerald Kokoshnik tiara does exactly that. Built in the Russian kokoshnik style and set with rows of diamonds framing intense emeralds, it carries an aesthetic language that predates modern restraint entirely. It belongs to an older Europe, one where monarchy communicated through scale, verticality, and brilliance that was meant to overwhelm rather than suggest. When it is worn, it does not blend, it announces. And that is precisely why its presence inside Elizabeth II's reign became increasingly selective. This tiara originated from the Greville bequest, like so many of the most politically complex pieces in the royal collection. It entered the crown's possession already loaded with interwar aristocratic history, a period when elite wealth and imperial networks still defined the highest levels of European society. But by the late 20th century, that visual language had changed. Monarchy was no longer expected to overwhelm. It was expected to reassure. And reassurance requires restraint. The emerald kokoshnik under palace lighting does not naturally suggest restraint. It suggests continuity with an older order of grandeur, one that modern audiences often interpret through a far more critical lens. And so, its appearances during Elizabeth II's reign became carefully spaced, almost strategic, not forbidden, but contained within occasion. It appears during moments where historical weight is appropriate: state visits, major jubilees, highly formal diplomatic dinners. But outside those contexts, it retreats, and over time, retreat itself becomes meaning. I find that aspect almost unsettling in its precision, because nothing about the jewel changed, only the frequency of its visibility did. The Saudi suite, a modern gift inside an ancient system. Not all sensitive jewels come from the distant past. Some enter the collection already carrying contemporary geopolitical weight. The Saudi suite, a collection of diamond jewellery presented to Queen Elizabeth II during state relations with Saudi Arabia, exists in exactly that space. Unlike older imperial pieces, these jewels are not tied to vanished European courts or colonial ceremonies. They are tied to modern diplomacy, modern statecraft, and modern controversies surrounding international relations, which makes them uniquely delicate, because modern political sensitivity does not fade with time in the same way historical symbolism does. It accumulates in real time. The suite itself is exquisite, large diamonds arranged in designs that reflect mid to late 20th century high jewellery aesthetics. but its significance inside the royal system was never purely aesthetic. It existed as part of ongoing diplomatic relationships that required careful balancing of public perception and state necessity. And that balancing act is where the monarchy becomes most visible and most constrained. Elizabeth II's use of such pieces was always extremely controlled, not because of personal hesitation, but because modern royal protocol requires constant awareness of how each object might be interpreted externally. A jewel in this context is never just a gift, it is a diplomatic artifact. And diplomatic artifacts do not behave like personal possessions. They require narrative discipline, so they appear sparingly, or not at all in certain periods, and over time that sparing use creates the impression of disappearance, even when nothing has technically been removed from circulation. The Girls of Great Britain. Tiara, the irony of familiarity. There is a paradox inside the royal collection that becomes clearer the longer you study it. Sometimes the most famous jewels are also the most emotionally neutral, and sometimes the most familiar pieces become the most carefully managed. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland. Tiara, later simply known as the Queen Mary fringe, is one of the most recognisable pieces in royal history. It was worn by Queen Elizabeth II herself on her wedding day, and later became associated with Princess Anne and Princess Beatrice. But familiarity does not mean freedom from symbolism. In fact, familiarity intensifies visibility, because every appearance becomes instantly recognisable across generations, and that recognition creates pressure. During Elizabeth II's reign, this tiara functioned as a kind of continuity anchor, used in weddings, portraits, and ceremonial moments where the monarchy needed to project stability rather than transformation. But even here, subtle shifts occurred. It was used in carefully defined contexts. It was paired with specific types of imagery. It became less a decorative object and more a controlled symbol of lineage. And what is fascinating is that even a safe jewel like this still participates in the same system of managed visibility as the more controversial pieces. It simply occupies the visible side of it, which reveals something important. The Forbidden Vault is not a separate category of objects. It is a spectrum of visibility. The Burmese ruby parure, fire that required discipline. Few royal jewel sets carry the same visual intensity as the Burmese ruby parure. Deep red stones set into diamond frameworks, designed to produce an almost flame-like effect under formal lighting. Rubies, historically, have always carried symbolic associations with protection, vitality, and power. In the Burmese context, they are also deeply tied to national identity and cultural significance. And that dual meaning creates complexity. During Elizabeth II's reign, the parure was used, but sparingly, and often in contexts where its intensity complemented rather than dominated the diplomatic atmosphere. Because visually, it is not a neutral set. It is emotional in appearance. And emotional visibility inside monarchy must always be managed carefully. The rubies appear almost alive under certain conditions, not metaphorically, visually. They reflect light in a way that makes them seem internally illuminated. That kind of intensity can overwhelm softer ceremonial settings, so they are deployed strategically, never absent, never constant, always calibrated, and that calibration is the recurring theme across the entire collection, because when you step back from each individual jewel, when you stop seeing them as isolated objects and begin seeing them as part of a single system, a pattern emerges that is far more important than any single forbidden piece. Nothing is truly hidden in a dramatic sense. Everything remains. But not everything is allowed to speak at the same volume. And Elizabeth II's true role, perhaps more than any official title suggests, was as the regulator of that volume, deciding which parts of history could be seen clearly, which could appear only occasionally, and which would remain in controlled silence beneath Buckingham Palace, intact but intentionally unheard. The Tech Crescent Tiara, a forgotten lineage written in diamonds. Some jewels do not disappear because they are controversial. They disappear because they belong to a lineage of meaning that slowly loses its public audience. The Tech Crescent tiara is one of those pieces. At first glance, it appears modest compared to the Imperial giants of the collection. A delicate crescent of diamonds, structured with restrained elegance rather than overwhelming scale. But its history reaches back into a network of German-British royal connections that became politically sensitive after the First World War. The Tech family, from which it originates, was part of that older European dynastic web that modern Britain gradually distanced itself from in both language and symbolism after 1918. Names were changed, titles were softened, associations were redefined, and jewellery followed the same quiet process. The tiara passed into Queen Mary's possession, then into the wider royal collection, where it was worn occasionally but never prominently. By Elizabeth II's reign, it occupied a strange position, not forbidden, not scandalous, but historically displaced. It no longer matched the narrative the monarchy wanted to emphasise, and so it drifted into near invisibility, not because anyone removed it, but because it no longer fit the visual language of modern monarchy. I find this kind of disappearance almost more haunting than political concealment. It is the slow fading of relevance, where an object remains physically intact but gradually stops belonging to the present tense. The Portuguese sapphire parure, a diplomatic gift that outgrew its moment. Unlike older European dynastic pieces, the Portuguese sapphire parure entered the royal collection as a diplomatic gift in the 19th century, symbolising alliances between royal houses during a period when monarchy functioned as an interconnected European system. Large sapphires, diamond frameworks, a design meant to signal prestige and mutual recognition between courts. But the world that produced it no longer exists. By the time of Elizabeth II, Portugal itself had undergone profound political transformation, moving through monarchy, revolution, dictatorship, and democracy. The jewel remained, but the diplomatic meaning that once justified its prominence had dissolved into history. This creates a unique problem inside royal collections. What do you do with objects whose original purpose has vanished entirely? You preserve them, but you rarely centre them. And so the sapphire parure becomes part of the background architecture of the vault, maintained, ensured, documented, but increasingly absent from public ceremonial life. There is no single decision that removes it, only gradual hesitation, and hesitation repeated over decades becomes invisibility. The Queen Alexandra wedding necklace, memory that becomes too heavy. Not all jewels are politically sensitive. Some are emotionally saturated to the point where visibility itself becomes complicated. The Queen Alexandra wedding necklace is one such object. Created for a royal wedding that symbolised stability and continuity at the time, it later became associated with generations of royal women whose lives were defined by expectation, performance, and emotional discipline. Alexandra herself was admired, adored, and constantly observed, a figure whose public image was almost entirely constructed through ceremonial visibility, and that visibility left residue. Inside royal memory, Alexandra's jewels carry a dual identity, celebration and constraint. They represent beauty, but also the pressure of being constantly seen as a symbol rather than a person. Elizabeth II inherited that duality, and over time, certain pieces associated with Alexandra appeared less frequently in modern contexts, not because they were inappropriate, but because they carried a kind of emotional density that did not always align with contemporary presentation. I think this is one of the most subtle forms of forbidden status inside the vault, not political restriction, but emotional gravity. A jewel becomes difficult to wear when it no longer feels neutral, when it feels like memory rather than ornament. The Prince Albert brooches, grief encoded in gold. Some objects inside the royal collection are inseparable from mourning. The Prince Albert brooches belong to that category. Originally associated with Queen Victoria's deep grief after the death of Prince Albert, these pieces are part of a broader tradition of mourning jewellery. Objects created not just to be worn, but to carry emotional memory in physical form. Over generations they remained within the royal collection, passed down as historical artefacts as much as decorative items, but their meaning never fully resets. Every time they appear, they carry echoes of loss. Elizabeth II, who lived through multiple layers of personal and institutional grief, understood this more deeply than most. Her reign contained long periods where continuity and mourning coexisted, coronations remembered alongside funerals, jubilees alongside national tragedies. And in that environment, certain jewels associated strongly with grief became less frequent in public use, not because they were inappropriate, but because they were emotionally specific. They belong to moments that cannot be generalised, and monarchy, especially modern monarchy, relies on universality of symbolism. When an object becomes too specific in emotional meaning, it becomes harder to place into public narrative without distortion, so it returns to storage, not hidden, just respectfully withdrawn. And across all these pieces, Teck, Portuguese sapphire, Alexandra's legacy, mourning brooches, a single pattern continues to repeat itself with quiet consistency. The royal vault does not operate through prohibition. It operates through compatibility. Each jewel is constantly evaluated, consciously or unconsciously, against the needs of the present moment, political climate, public sensitivity, historical interpretation, media environment, generational memory. If a piece aligns, it appears. If it does not, it waits. And if the mismatch lasts long enough, waiting becomes permanent visibility loss, not destruction, not scandal. Just time deciding that certain objects no longer belong in the foreground of history. And Elizabeth II, perhaps more than any monarch before her, became the careful administrator of that boundary, deciding moment by moment which fragments of the past could still safely shine in the present light, and which would remain intact, preserved, and silently out of view beneath Buckingham Palace as history continued to move forward without them. The Imperial State emeralds, power that became too visible. Among all the objects associated with the British crown, few carry the immediate visual authority of the Imperial State emeralds, deep green stones set into diamond frameworks that seem designed not for subtlety, but for command. In earlier centuries, that was the point. Royal jewellery was not meant to blend into the background. It was meant to dominate perception, to establish hierarchy in physical form. Emeralds, in particular, were associated with permanence and sovereign legitimacy across multiple European traditions. But permanence is a difficult concept in the modern world, and legitimacy is constantly negotiated. By Elizabeth II's reign, these emeralds occupied a complicated space inside the royal system. They were never removed from the collection. They were never declared inappropriate. But their visibility became increasingly selective. Because emeralds do something unusual under light. They hold attention. They do not scatter it like diamonds. They anchor it. And in a media environment where attention itself is politically sensitive, that becomes a problem of interpretation rather than beauty. In earlier eras, that anchoring effect would have been desirable. It signalled authority, stability, continuity. In the late 20th century, it risked appearing as excessive assertion, so their appearances narrowed, not erased, narrowed. And that distinction defines almost every jewel we are discussing. The Hanover floral tiara, a dynasty that Britain learned to reframe. The Hanover floral tiara carries within it one of the most complex genealogical histories in European monarchy. It connects Britain to the House of Hanover, a German dynastic line that once ruled Britain and shaped its 18th and 19th century political identity. But after the First World War, German associations became politically sensitive in British public consciousness. Names were changed, titles were reinterpreted. The monarchy gradually repositioned itself as distinctly British in identity, even while its genealogy remained fundamentally European. Jewels followed that transformation quietly. The Hanover floral tiara, once part of a broader dynastic narrative, became increasingly peripheral in public royal imagery. It did not disappear because it was controversial in a modern scandal sense. It disappeared because its historical framing no longer matched the monarchy's post-war identity construction. And this is where something subtle happens inside royal collections. Objects do not need to be rejected to become irrelevant. They only need to stop reinforcing the current narrative. From that point on, they become archival rather than active, and archival status in monarchy often looks exactly like absence. The sapphire and diamond fringe necklace, the problem of repetition. There are jewels inside the royal collection that are not rare in material terms, but rare in narrative presence. The sapphire and diamond fringe necklace belongs to this category. It is structurally elegant, repeated sapphire elements framed by diamond geometry, designed for ceremonial symmetry rather than individual dramatics. It is not visually aggressive. It does not dominate a frame. It supports it, and that is precisely why it has endured. But endurance does not guarantee prominence. During Elizabeth II's reign, this kind of piece often functioned as background symbolism, used when the monarchy needed continuity rather than spectacle. However, repetition also has a quiet effect over time. It normalises visibility to the point where the object becomes less noticed, and in a media environment saturated with imagery, invisibility can happen even to things that are physically present. This creates a paradox inside the vault. Some jewels disappear because they are too powerful. Others disappear because they are too familiar. And both forms of disappearance are functionally similar. The Russian sapphire cluster brooch, revolution encoded in stone. Certain jewels inside the collection carry histories that extend beyond Britain entirely into revolution, exile, and the collapse of entire political systems. The Russian sapphire cluster brooches are among them. Their origins lie in the fragmented aftermath of the Romanov dynasty, where jewels were dispersed across Europe following the Russian Revolution. Each surviving piece carries not just aesthetic value, but historical rupture, evidence of a world that ended violently and abruptly. Inside Elizabeth II's reign, these objects existed in a particularly sensitive symbolic space. They were beautiful, they were historically significant, but they were also reminders of instability at the highest level of monarchy. And monarchy, as an institution, is fundamentally dependent on the projection of stability. So these pieces were handled with care, not because they were dangerous, but because they were emotionally and historically loaded in ways that could shift interpretation depending on global context. During moments of geopolitical tension or heightened sensitivity around monarchy as a concept, such objects tended to recede from visibility, not because of policy, but because of caution. The Oriental sapphire tiara, beauty that became ambiguous. The Oriental sapphire tiara is one of those pieces whose very name reflects a historical vocabulary that has become increasingly complex in modern interpretation. Created in an era when Oriental was used broadly in European decorative arts, it combines sapphire brilliance with diamond structure in a design that is both intricate and unmistakably imperial in tone. In earlier decades, it functioned as a classic example of royal ceremonial jewellery. But in later periods, its interpretive environment changed. Not the jewel itself, but the language surrounding it, the cultural framing and the sensitivity toward terminology and historical context. And that shift matters, because in modern monarchy, even naming conventions influence visibility. The tiara was not removed, but its narrative framing became more cautious, more contextual, and less central in public presentation. And that is another form of invisibility, one that operates through discourse rather than storage. Across all these cases, emeralds that anchor attention, Hanover lineage pieces that no longer match narrative identity, repetitive sapphire designs that fade into familiarity, Russian fragments of revolution, and culturally reframed tiaras. A single system continues to operate beneath the surface. Nothing is truly excluded. Everything remains preserved. But visibility is constantly recalibrated, and Elizabeth II's role inside that system was not to decide what existed, it was to decide what could still be seen, without destabilising the meaning of monarchy itself. Some jewels were too powerful, some too familiar, some too politically entangled, and some, most importantly, too historically alive. So they waited, not erased, not lost, just held in a controlled state of silence beneath Buckingham Palace, where history does not disappear but simply stops speaking aloud. The diamond diadem, the crown that cannot disappear. There are jewels that can be withheld, and there are jewels that cannot. The diamond diadem belongs to the second category. Unlike many pieces in the royal collection that move in and out of visibility depending on political climate or emotional sensitivity, this one occupies a fixed position in the visual identity of the British monarchy. It is not merely jewellery. It is part of the monarchy's official silhouette. Instantly recognisable, structurally consistent, and deeply embedded in state iconography. And yet, even here, within something so stable, there are subtler shifts. The diadem is worn most often during coronations, parliamentary openings, and formal state portraits. It represents sovereignty in its most distilled visual form. Diamonds arranged in a circlet of near-perfect symmetry, combining floral motifs with geometric precision. But its meaning is not as static as its shape, because even fixed symbols are interpreted differently across generations. In Elizabeth II's early reign, the diadem carried the weight of post-war restoration. It appeared in a Britain still recovering from conflict, still defining its modern identity. In that context, it symbolised continuity, a bridge between wartime endurance and constitutional stability. By the later decades, however, the same object existed in a very different interpretive environment. A more sceptical public, a more global media ecosystem, a monarchy increasingly required to justify its symbolic visibility rather than assume it. And so even the diadem's appearances became more tightly framed within ceremonial necessity rather than aesthetic display. It was never absent, but it was carefully contained. And containment, again, is the recurring logic beneath everything in the vault. The Kent amethyst suite, a colour that no longer speaks loudly. Not every jewel loses visibility because of political sensitivity. Some fade because their aesthetic language no longer aligns with contemporary taste or symbolic expectation. The Kent amethyst suite is a quiet example of this process. Amethysts, historically associated with sobriety, dignity, and restraint, once held strong ceremonial value in European royal courts. The suite itself, composed of amethyst stones set into diamond frameworks, reflects a style of royal jewellery that emphasises harmony over spectacle. In earlier eras, this made it ideal for formal occasions where visual moderation was appropriate. But over time, amethysts began to feel less central in royal visual storytelling, not because they lost beauty, but because the symbolic hierarchy of gemstones shifted. Diamonds became dominant in ceremonial identity. Sapphires became associated with continuity and diplomacy. Emeralds retained imperial resonance, but required careful contextual framing. Amethysts, by comparison, receded into the background. And in monarchy, the background is often indistinguishable from absence. The Kent amethyst suite remains part of the collection, preserved and maintained. But its appearances in high-profile royal imagery during Elizabeth II's reign became increasingly rare. This is not a disappearance driven by controversy. It is disappearance driven by relevance drift, a slower, quieter form of historical fading. The Stuart sapphire, a stone that remembers too much history. The Stuart sapphire is one of the oldest stones in the crown jewels, and with age comes an accumulation of narrative weight that is difficult to neutralise. It is a stone that has passed through dynasties, exile, restoration, and political transformation. It has been embedded in crowns, moved across centuries, and recontextualised repeatedly as monarchy itself evolved. And that makes it unusually complex in modern interpretation. Unlike newer pieces, which can be framed within relatively stable historical narratives, the Stuart sapphire carries multiple overlapping identities, each tied to different phases of British constitutional development. That layering of meaning makes it powerful, but also difficult, because layered symbolism resists simplification. In Elizabeth II's reign, the stone remained present in ceremonial regalia, yet its visibility was inherently bound to institutional occasions rather than personal or adaptable use. It does not circulate, it does not adapt, it remains anchored to tradition in its most formal sense, and that anchoring is both its strength and its limitation. It cannot disappear, but it also cannot easily change how it is seen. The George IV state diadem. Excess that became historical distance. Some jewels inside the collection do not fade because they are politically sensitive or emotionally charged. They fade because they represent an aesthetic of monarchy that no longer aligns with modern expectations of restraint. The George IV state diadem is one of the clearest examples of this transition. Originally designed in the early 19th century, it reflects a style of royal display that prioritises maximal visual impact, dense diamond arrangements, elevated structure, and an almost theatrical sense of grandeur. In its original context, this was not excessive. It was expected. Monarchy in that era was openly performative, visually dominant, and structurally hierarchical. But in the modern constitutional age, especially under Elizabeth II, that visual language required careful moderation. The diadem remained part of the crown jewels, of course. It was not altered or hidden. But its usage became strictly ceremonial, aligned with occasions where historical tradition justified its presence. Outside those contexts, it did not circulate, and over time, that limited circulation creates a subtle perceptual effect. Even objects that remain fully intact can begin to feel distant, almost archival, not because they are forgotten, but because they are no longer visually integrated into everyday symbolic life. Across all these pieces, the diamond diadem that defines sovereignty, the fading amethyst suite of restrained elegance, the ancient Stuart sapphire carrying centuries of layered identity, and the George IV diadem representing a more theatrical monarchy, a consistent structure becomes visible. The royal vault is not organised around secrecy in the conventional sense. It is organised around fit. What fits the present moment remains visible. What does not fit is preserved but distanced. And Elizabeth II's long reign can be understood in this context as a continuous act of calibration, adjusting not only what the monarchy shows, but how intensely it shows it. Some jewels were always visible, some appeared only when meaning required them, and some remained intact, documented and preserved, yet effectively removed from the active visual language of the crown. Not forbidden, not lost, just waiting for a version of the present that would allow them to speak again without disrupting the fragile balance between history, symbolism, and modern perception. The sapphire coronation necklace, a symbol that cannot be rewritten. There are jewels that adapt, jewels that retreat, and jewels that define the system itself so completely that they cannot meaningfully disappear at all. The sapphire coronation necklace belongs to that final category. Unlike tiaras or brooches that shift in and out of rotation depending on circumstance, this necklace is structurally tied to the language of coronation and state ceremony. It is not merely decorative, it is constitutional in function, part of the visual grammar that transforms an individual into a sovereign in public perception. And that makes it fundamentally different from everything else in the vault, because it does not simply represent monarchy, it enacts it. In Elizabeth II's reign, Its presence was steady but tightly controlled within specific ceremonial frameworks. It appeared in contexts where continuity needed to be visually reinforced: state portraits, official receptions, and highly formal diplomatic events where symbolism had to be unambiguous. But even here, subtle changes in interpretation occurred over time. In the mid-20th century, such a necklace could be read primarily as a symbol of stability after war. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it also carried the additional burden of historical consciousness. A public increasingly aware of wealth inequality, inherited privilege, and the long arc of imperial history. The object did not change. The world around it did. And that shift is what quietly reshapes every jewel in the collection. Elizabeth II never removed such pieces from circulation. That would have been structurally impossible in many cases. Instead, she managed their visibility with extreme precision, ensuring they appeared only in contexts where their meaning remained institutionally stable rather than publicly contestable. This is where monarchy becomes most technical, almost engineering-like in its control of perception. A necklace is not chosen simply because it is beautiful. It is chosen because it does not destabilize interpretation. The Tech sapphire brooch, a name that slowly disappears from memory. Some jewels fade not because of controversy, but because the names attached to them drift away from public recognition. The Tech sapphire brooch is one such example. Originating from the Tech lineage, a German-British aristocratic connection that became politically sensitive in the wake of the First World War, the piece carries within it the history of renaming, reframing, and gradual distancing from continental European dynastic identity. After the war, many royal titles and associations connected to German houses were deliberately softened or recontextualized within British royal identity. This was not a single decision, but a slow cultural transition shaped by public sentiment and geopolitical reality. The brooch itself remained intact, but its narrative presence diminished. In earlier decades, such pieces would have been understood instinctively by audiences familiar with European royal networks. In later generations, that context was no longer immediate, and when context fades, objects become visually present but historically opaque. That opacity reduces usage, not because of prohibition, but because meaning requires translation, and translation slows ceremonial clarity. So the brooch becomes one of those quiet artifacts that still exists in full technical capacity, but appears only occasionally in modern imagery. A jewel preserved, but no longer central. The Greville chandelier earrings, light that became too public. Among the Greville bequest pieces, the chandelier earrings occupy a particularly revealing space in the psychology of royal display. They are designed to move, to catch light, to amplify presence through motion rather than static structure. In earlier aristocratic contexts, this kind of jewellery was associated with formal evening display, candlelit rooms, controlled audiences, and environments where movement itself was part of visual performance. But in modern media conditions, movement becomes magnified. A single shift of the head becomes global imagery within seconds, and that transformation alters how such pieces function inside royal presentation. Elizabeth II wore chandelier-style pieces, but increasingly within tightly controlled contexts where visual unpredictability was minimised. The goal was never to suppress beauty, but to ensure that beauty did not become destabilised by uncontrolled interpretation. Because in the age of high-resolution imagery and constant replay, motion is no longer ephemeral, it is permanent record. And permanence changes meaning. So even jewels designed for dynamism are managed as if they are static symbols. The crown ruby pendant, intensity without narrative stability. Some gemstones are not rare because of their size or craftsmanship, but because of the intensity of perception they generate. The crown ruby pendant and a large central ruby surrounded by diamond framing is one such object. Rubies carry cultural associations across multiple traditions. vitality, protection, sovereignty, and in some historical contexts, authority that borders on the martial. This makes them powerful in ceremonial language, but also unstable in interpretation, because intensity without clear narrative framing can be read in multiple ways depending on context. In Elizabeth II's reign, such pieces appeared primarily during formal state events where their symbolism could be anchored within protocol. Outside those contexts, they were far less visible, not removed, not forbidden, but carefully positioned. This is an important distinction inside the royal vault system. Visibility is not binary, it is gradient, controlled by context, timing, and interpretive safety. And rubies, more than many other stones, require that safety, because they do not fade into background perception, they hold attention, and attention in modern monarchy is always politically charged. The final pattern, where the vault stops being a place. If you step back from all of these individual cases, coronation sapphires, Tech lineage brooches, Greville earrings, ruby pendants, a structural reality becomes clear. The royal vault is not defined by what is stored inside it. It is defined by what is allowed to circulate outward. Everything remains preserved. Everything remains documented. Nothing is truly destroyed. But circulation is continuously filtered through a system that responds to historical sensitivity, political climate, media environment, emotional association, institutional stability. And Elizabeth II, over the course of her long reign, became the central operator of that system, not by issuing dramatic prohibitions, but by maintaining a continuous equilibrium between visibility and restraint. Some jewels remained constant, some appeared occasionally like controlled memories, and others entered a state that is neither absence nor presence, but suspension, existing fully in material terms, yet almost entirely removed from the active visual language of monarchy, not erased from history, but held just outside its immediate gaze, as if the past itself has to pass a quiet test before it is allowed to be seen again. The sapphire and pearl fringe parure, a memory that repeats without changing. Some jewels inside the royal collection do not fade, disappear, or retreat. They repeat. The sapphire and pearl fringe parure is one of those rare cases where visibility does not depend on controversy, emotional burden, or political sensitivity. Instead, it depends on function, the role it plays in reinforcing continuity across generations. At its core, the design is deceptively simple. Alternating sapphires and pearls arranged in structured symmetry, designed to complement formal state dress rather than dominate it. It is a system of visual balance rather than spectacle, and that balance is exactly why it persists. During Elizabeth II's reign, this kind of jewel served a very specific purpose. It stabilised imagery. It created continuity across decades of changing political landscapes, media environments, and generational expectations. Where more dramatic pieces carried historical weight or diplomatic risk, this parure offered something else entirely: predictability. And in monarchy, predictability is not boring. It is protective. The interesting tension, however, lies in how repetition itself slowly alters perception. A jewel worn repeatedly over decades begins to accumulate association, not with a single event, but with an entire era. It becomes less an object and more a visual timestamp. And timestamps can eventually feel like history rather than presence. That is how even consistent pieces begin to drift toward the edges of perception, not through absence but through familiarity. Elizabeth II understood this effect instinctively. Repetition was not accidental, it was structural. It reinforced the idea that the monarchy itself remained stable despite external change, but it also meant that certain pieces became so associated with continuity that they stopped feeling new in any ceremonial sense. They became part of the background architecture of royal identity. And background, by definition, is rarely noticed. The Hisa diamond earrings, a fragmented European legacy. The Hesse diamond earrings carry a different kind of complexity, one rooted in fragmented European dynastic history. Originating from the German House of Hesse, these earrings entered the broader royal network through intermarriage and inheritance patterns that once defined European monarchy as an interconnected system rather than a set of separate national institutions. Before the First World War, such connections were normal. Royal families across Europe were tightly interwoven, sharing not only bloodlines but also material culture, jewels, portraits, ceremonial traditions. But after the war, that network was politically destabilised. Associations with German houses became sensitive in British public consciousness. Names were altered, titles reframed, cultural emphasis shifted toward national identity rather than dynastic Europe, and jewels followed that shift quietly. The Hesse earrings remained part of the collection, but their narrative context became less prominent in public-facing descriptions. They were no longer framed as part of a shared European royal ecosystem, but as inherited artefacts within the British Crown's internal history. That reframing is subtle but significant, because it transforms meaning without altering material reality. The diamonds do not change, but their interpretive world does, and once that interpretive world shifts, visibility naturally adjusts with it. The Burmese sapphire cluster bracelet, intensity that requires distance. Some jewels are not politically sensitive because of origin or history, but because of visual intensity itself. The Burmese sapphire cluster bracelet is a strong example of this phenomenon. Composed of deeply saturated sapphires arranged in clustered formations, the bracelet produces a visual density that is striking even among royal collections known for their extravagance. Unlike linear designs, clustered arrangements create a sense of concentrated visual force, a compact field of colour and light that draws attention immediately and holds it. In ceremonial contexts, this kind of intensity must be carefully managed, because it does not blend into broader visual composition. It defines it. During Elizabeth II's reign, pieces like this were used selectively, often in environments where their intensity aligned with the tone of the occasion. But in other contexts, they remained in storage not due to prohibition, but due to interpretive risk. Because intensity is not neutral, it is directional. It shapes attention in ways that cannot always be controlled once released into global media circulation. And in a world where images persist indefinitely, that becomes a strategic consideration rather than an aesthetic one. So the bracelet remains part of the collection, but its visibility is calibrated rather than constant. The Hanover Diamond Drop Necklace, a name that carries its own history. Names inside royal jewellery collections are not arbitrary. They are historical signals. The Hanover Diamond Drop Necklace carries within its name a direct reference to a dynastic lineage that once defined British monarchy itself. The House of Hanover ruled Britain for over a century, shaping constitutional evolution, political identity, and cultural transition. But in the modern era, that identity has been reframed through a more nationally centred narrative of monarchy. And that reframing affects how objects associated with older dynastic labels are perceived. The necklace itself is structurally elegant, a sequence of diamond drops arranged in vertical symmetry, designed for formal evening wear. It is neither politically charged nor emotionally burdened in any direct sense. But its historical naming situates it within a broader European dynastic memory that no longer occupies the same prominence in public consciousness. And that shift matters, because royal symbolism depends heavily on immediate recognisability. If meaning requires explanation, it loses part of its ceremonial function. So over time, pieces like this move gradually toward lower visibility cycles, still present, still preserved, but less frequently highlighted in major public imagery. Not hidden, not restricted, just less central. The system beneath all jewels, where meaning becomes the real collection. At a certain point in this exploration, it becomes clear that the most important transformation is not happening to individual jewels, it is happening to the system that governs them. Because the royal vault is not simply a repository of physical wealth, it is a dynamic system of controlled visibility, a structure that continuously negotiates between history, politics, emotion, and public perception. And within that system, some jewels remain constant anchors, some circulate selectively, some fade into near invisibility through relevance drift, and some remain physically present but interpretively suspended. Elizabeth II did not design this system from scratch. She inherited it, but she refined it through decades of extremely consistent decision-making, not dramatic decisions, incremental ones, choices about when something should appear, how often, under what circumstances, and in what symbolic context. Over time, those incremental choices reshape perception entirely. What the public sees is not the full collection. It is a curated expression of it. And what remains unseen is not absent. It is simply governed by conditions that are rarely visible from the outside. That is the quiet truth beneath all of these stories. The jewels are not divided into allowed and forbidden. They are divided into what can safely carry meaning in the present moment, and what must remain preserved until history itself changes enough to reinterpret them again. The Cullinan 3 and 4 brooch, a fragment of the largest diamond that became too complete. There is a particular kind of jewel inside the Crown collection that carries a strange contradiction. It is both fragment and perfection at the same time. Cullinan III and IV, often worn together as a brooch, are cut from the legendary Cullinan diamond, the largest gem-quality diamond ever discovered. The original stone was so vast that it had to be divided into multiple major stones, each given its own identity, its own setting, its own ceremonial life. And yet, despite being pieces, they are not perceived as incomplete. They are perceived as concentrated authority. During Elizabeth II's reign, this brooch became one of the most recognisable elements of her personal jewellery repertoire. It appears in countless portraits, state occasions, and informal royal engagements. It sits high on the dress, near the collarbone, almost like a seal rather than decoration. And that positioning matters, because unlike tiaras or necklaces that frame the head or dominate the chest, this brooch operates as a focal point, a compressed symbol of continuity, stability, and institutional identity. But even here, beneath familiarity, there is a subtle shift over time. The Cullinan fragments carry with them the history of imperial extraction, geological rarity, and the long transformation of a raw stone into multiple symbols of state power. That history does not disappear, it accumulates, and accumulation changes interpretation. In earlier decades, the brooch could be read primarily as a marvel of craftsmanship and continuity. In later years, it also exists within a broader public awareness of where such wealth originated and how imperial histories are reassessed in modern discourse. So even the most safe and frequently used jewel is not exempt from interpretive pressure. It remains visible, but never fully neutral. The Cullinan 5 brooch, intimacy that replaced grandeur. If Cullinan 3 and 4 represent institutional authority, Cullinan 5 represents something quieter, almost intimate. A heart-shaped diamond set in platinum, designed not to dominate a visual field, but to sit close to the body, often pinned to the chest in moments that require subtle symbolism rather than formal declaration. And this difference is essential. Because monarchy does not only operate through grandeur, it also operates through controlled softness, moments where symbolism is reduced in scale but not in meaning. Elizabeth II wore this piece frequently, and its repeated use created a different kind of association, stability not through spectacle, but through consistency. However, even intimate jewels are not free from historical layering. Cullinan 5 is still part of the same geological origin as the rest of the Cullinan diamond, meaning it carries the same imperial and colonial historical context, just in a more subdued form. And that creates a quiet tension. How does one interpret intimacy built from imperial magnitude? The answer inside the royal system is not to resolve the tension, but to manage it through context. It appears in settings where emotional tone is appropriate, remembrance, continuity, formal but not overpowering engagements, and in that careful placement it remains visible without becoming overwhelming. The festoon necklace, a pattern that repeats across generations. The festoon necklace is one of those designs that feels almost mathematical in structure. Diamond segments arranged in symmetrical drapes, creating a visual rhythm that repeats across the neckline like a controlled pattern of light. Unlike statement pieces designed to stand out, festoon designs are built to integrate, to work with other elements of royal dress rather than dominate them. And that makes them incredibly useful inside the monarchy's visual system, because they do not compete with symbolism, they support it. During Elizabeth II's reign, festoon-style necklaces were often used in contexts where clarity and composure were more important than spectacle. State portraits, diplomatic receptions, and formal photographs relied on this kind of visual equilibrium. But repetition, again, is not neutral. Over time, patterns become associated with eras, and eras eventually become history, which means even the most stable design language slowly transitions from present function into archival identity, not through disappearance, but through accumulation of time. The Prince of Wales, feathers brooch, identity encoded in ornament. Not all jewels are defined by gemstones. Some are defined by iconography. The Prince of Wales feathers brooch is one such object, a piece that carries within it one of the most recognisable symbols of British royal identity, the three feathers, the coronet, and the motto associated with the Prince of Wales title. Unlike gemstone-centric pieces, this brooch is primarily symbolic rather than material in emphasis. Its meaning is immediately legible within British constitutional tradition, and that clarity gives it a different kind of stability, but also a different kind of limitation. Because symbols that are too legible can become rigid. They cannot easily shift meaning without altering identity itself. During Elizabeth II's reign, such pieces functioned as identity markers rather than aesthetic variables. They were used in contexts where recognition of institutional continuity was more important than visual variation. And yet, even here, there is subtle evolution. As the role of the monarchy evolved over time, symbols like this began to carry additional interpretive layers, not just heritage identity, but also historical continuity under modern constitutional scrutiny. So even fixed symbols become subject to changing perception, not because they change, but because the audience does. The final layer where even familiar jewels begin to feel historical. At this point in the vault's internal logic, something important becomes visible. There is no clear boundary between active and inactive jewels. There is only frequency of appearance. And frequency shapes perception more than official classification ever could. Cullinan fragments remain iconic. Festoon necklaces remain functional. Symbolic brooches remain legible. But each of them participates in a system where visibility is constantly adjusted against external context. And that adjustment is what defines Elizabeth II's role more than any single object. She did not simply inherit a collection of extraordinary jewels. She inherited a system in which every jewel must continuously justify its presence in the public eye. Some did so effortlessly, some required careful framing, and some gradually moved into the background not because they were rejected, but because their meaning required conditions that the modern world no longer reliably provides. And in that sense, the Forbidden Vault is not a chamber of locked objects. It is a living boundary between what history can safely express, and what it must temporarily hold back until the world is ready to interpret it again without distortion. By the final decades of Elizabeth II's reign, something subtle had already begun to happen inside the crown jewel system. not a disappearance, not a restructuring, but a slowing. The objects themselves did not change. They had long since reached their material finality. Diamonds do not evolve. Emeralds do not reinterpret themselves. Tiara frameworks do not adapt to political climate. What changed was everything around them: context, language, expectation, and above all, perception. In earlier eras of monarchy, jewels were part of an active visual expansion of royal identity. They were deployed to assert presence in a world where monarchy still competed visually and politically with other forms of authority. But in Elizabeth II's later reign, that competition no longer existed in the same way. The monarchy had become constitutional, stabilised, and largely symbolic, and that transformation quietly altered what jewels were for. They were no longer instruments of assertion. They became instruments of continuity. And continuity, unlike assertion, does not demand expansion. It demands repetition, calibration, and restraint. There is a point in every long reign where repetition stops being routine and starts becoming structure. Certain tiaras reappear across decades not because they are preferred, but because they are stable. Certain brooches return in cycles because they do not disrupt interpretation. Certain necklaces become quietly associated with state continuity rather than individual selection. And over time, this creates a visual language that no longer feels like choice. It feels like system. The viewer may not consciously register it, but the pattern is there. Fewer variations in ceremonial symbolism, more controlled recurrence of established pieces, less experimentation in public-facing regalia. And this is where the crown jewels begin to behave less like a collection and more like a grammar. A grammar that slowly narrows its active vocabulary, not because words are lost, but because fewer words are needed to express the same institutional idea. One of the most defining features of Elizabeth II's late reign is that the crown jewels system did not significantly expand in symbolic vocabulary. There were acquisitions, restorations, adjustments in maintenance, but very little that altered the core language of visibility. Instead, the system increasingly relied on what was already established: Cullinan fragments, state crowns, historic tiaras, diplomatic parures, pieces that had already been tested across decades of interpretation. And this reliance is important because it signals maturity of system but also closure of innovation. In earlier centuries, monarchy absorbed new objects as part of evolving identity. In Elizabeth II's reign, the focus shifted towards stability of interpretation rather than expansion of symbolism. And stability, once achieved, naturally reduces variation, which means the vault becomes less about addition and more about maintenance of meaning that has already been accepted. As time moved forward, certain categories of jewels began to appear less frequently in public-facing royal imagery, not because they were removed, but because their interpretive load became heavier than necessary for contemporary ceremonial communication. Highly historical pieces, highly geopolitically layered pieces, highly visually intense pieces, and even highly familiar pieces that had become too associated with specific eras. Each of these categories did not vanish. They simply moved further from the centre of visual repetition, and that movement is gradual enough that it is almost invisible in real time. But over decades, it becomes structurally significant, because what remains most visible is no longer the full collection. It is a carefully stabilised subset of it, one that prioritises clarity over complexity, continuity over density, recognition over reinterpretation. By the end of Elizabeth II's reign, the function of the crown jewels had completed a quiet transformation. They were no longer primarily instruments of spectacle. They had become instruments of stabilisation of national identity, stabilisation of ceremonial language, stabilisation of historical continuity in a rapidly changing global environment. And in that transformation, their visibility was no longer about impressing audiences. It was about preventing interpretive overload, because modern audiences no longer encounter monarchy in isolation. They encounter it through constant media layers, historical awareness, and global comparative frameworks. And in that environment, excessive symbolic density can become noise rather than meaning. So the system adapts, by narrowing, by repeating, by carefully selecting what can safely carry the weight of representation. In the final years, something even quieter becomes noticeable, not in official statements, not in ceremonial documentation, but in rhythm. The rhythm of appearances slows, the repetition becomes more predictable, the set of frequently used pieces stabilises further, and the broader collection, vast, complex, historically layered, remains intact, but increasingly distant from the active visual surface of monarchy. This is not decline, it is completion of a cycle, because a reign of this length inevitably reaches a point where its symbolic system has already been fully formed. And once fully formed, it no longer expands in meaning. It preserves what it has already established. Elizabeth II's relationship with the crown jewels was never about possession in a simple sense. It was about management of continuity across time that outlived individual interpretation. And by the end, that management reached a state where most variables had already been resolved. Which pieces define state authority? Which pieces define continuity? Which pieces define diplomacy? Which pieces remain historically present but visually distant? What remained was not uncertainty. It was equilibrium. A carefully maintained balance between visibility and restraint, between history and present interpretation, between the weight of centuries and the necessity of modern clarity. And in that equilibrium, the jewels did not fade. They settled into a system that no longer needed to expand its language, only to preserve it precisely, quietly, and with the awareness that every object inside the vault now belonged as much to memory as it did to the living present of the crown. There is a point in every long institution where continuity stops feeling like a line and starts feeling like a threshold. In the final chapter of Elizabeth II's life, the crown jewel system had already reached that threshold. Nothing had been dismantled. Nothing had been removed. Nothing had been declared obsolete. But something quieter had already changed. The centre of gravity was no longer a person. It was a structure continuing without needing visible affirmation. And that is where monarchy becomes most difficult to read from the outside, because almost everything still looks the same. The crowns are still polished. The tiaras still exist in their cases. The brooches still appear in photographs. The ceremonial logic remains intact, but the meaning has shifted from use to inheritance of use, from action to memory of action, from living system to stabilized form. And in that transition, the jewels stop behaving like participants in history. They begin to behave like witnesses of it. In the last years, certain patterns became quietly noticeable to those who studied royal imagery closely. Not dramatic changes, not symbolic ruptures, but a soft narrowing of variation, fewer unexpected combinations, fewer rare appearances of historically dense pieces, more reliance on established, repeatedly validated items of ceremonial identity. It was as if the system had gradually decided, without formal decision, that it already knew the safest possible visual language it could speak. And once that happens, the range of expression contracts, not out of loss, but out of caution shaped by accumulated time. Even jewels that had once appeared in broader rotation began to settle into familiar cycles, not because they were restricted, but because familiarity had become the safest form of clarity. And clarity at that stage mattered more than novelty. There is a temptation, when looking back, to treat monarchy as something passive, as if it simply has traditions. But in reality, systems of this scale are continuously curated through presence, repetition, and omission. And in Elizabeth II's case, that curation was not expressed through disruption, but through consistency so long it became invisible. She did not redefine the crown jewels. She stabilised their interpretive environment. She ensured that each object remained legible within a world that was constantly changing outside the palace walls. And that task, over decades, becomes less about selection and more about preventing distortion. Because distortion is what happens when historical objects meet unstable contemporary context without mediation. So the jewels were not just displayed, they were carefully kept within a controlled field of meaning, a field that grew quieter over time, not emptier. When Elizabeth II died, nothing about the crown jewels physically changed in that instant. But systems of meaning do not depend on physical alteration to transform. They depend on who is anchoring interpretation. And once that anchor shifts, everything around it begins to recontextualize itself, slowly, unevenly, across time. Objects that once felt anchored in lived continuity begin to feel archival. Objects that once felt familiar begin to feel historical. Objects that once felt stable begin to feel newly interpreted under a different sovereign presence. And yet the vault itself remains exactly as it was, which is the most important paradox of all. Nothing moves, but everything is reseen. After a reign of this length, silence is not emptiness, it is recalibration. The crown jewels continue to exist in their full material presence, unchanged, preserved, maintained with extraordinary precision, but the interpretive world around them adjusts. New ceremonial rhythms emerge, new patterns of use stabilise. Some pieces return more frequently, some recede further, and some remain exactly where they were, now read through a slightly different historical lens. This is how institutions survive beyond individuals, not by replacing meaning, but by slowly redistributing it. If there is a way to summarise what remains at the end of this long documentary arc, it is not a list of jewels, it is a condition in which history is fully present but never fully exposed, symbolism is active but never uncontrolled continuity is maintained without requiring constant explanation, and objects carry more memory than any single moment can contain. The crown jewels are not a collection frozen in time. They are a system that has learned how to survive time. And Elizabeth II's reign represents the longest period in which that system remained internally stable without losing external relevance, not by expanding its language, but by preserving its limits. And so the vault remains, not closed, not opened, but continuously interpreted through changing eyes. The jewels do not speak, they reflect. And what they reflect is never only the past they came from, but the present that is looking at them, trying to decide how much history it can safely allow to remain visible at once,